The dragon's molars. They said the apex was a dream of the modern age, glass towers, marble floors and elevators that whispered instead of groaned. It rose from the heart of the city like a blade, shining under the sunday, a symbol of wealth, power, and progress. And yet, even in daylight, something about it felt off. Too quiet, too hollow, the kind of silence that doesn't rest, but listens. Archie Lennox had seen his fair share of failed developments. He worked for one of those consulting firms that came in when luxury turned to liability, when investors started whispering and tenants started leaving. But the Apex was different. It wasn't losing money. It was losing people. 18 to be exact. All of them fell from the upper balcony's floors that had been sealed ever since. The papers called them the Apex Leaps. On his first day inside, Archie felt the cold immediately. Not the kind of cold that came from bad insulation. It was the stillness of a sealed tomb. The air didn't move, not even when the front doors closed behind him. The lobby looked perfect. Too perfect. White marble, polished like bone, gold accents gleaming under fluorescent lights. But the fountains were off, the plants fake, and the receptionist's desk abandoned. He muttered, "It's like time stopped here." Behind him, a woman's voice replied, "Time doesn't stop, dear. It hides." Archie turned. It was an old woman, wearing a faded shawl and carrying a thermos of tea. Her small souvenir shop, Nora's Keepsakes, was the only unit still open on the first floor. She smiled at him with a kind of tired knowing. "You're not from the management, are you?" "No. I'm here to evaluate the site. They want to know why people won't rent these floors." Her smile faded. "You won't find your answers in spreadsheets, son. You'll find them under your feet." Later that evening, she told him the story. Before the Apex was built, the ground beneath it wasn't a business district. It was a burial zone, a restricted field, one that no one wanted to touch. But investors don't fear ghosts. They fear delays. When the first pile was driven into the earth, workers found 8 sealed coffins made of stone, carved with dragon motifs and bound by metal nails the color of rust. The developer ordered them burned. He said it was superstition. But the local geomancer, an old man with white eyes and a cane carved like a serpent, tried to stop them. He warned, "You've placed your building on the dragon's molars, 8 teeth of the earth that hold down its hunger. Remove them, and the dragon will bite." No one listened. The nails were melted, the coffins reduced to dust. Construction went on as planned. And then, a year after opening day, the first man jumped. Archie wasn't one to believe in curses, but that night, back in his hotel room, he couldn't stop thinking about what she said. "Under your feet." He searched the archives, found an old engineering report. The foundation drawing showed something strange. 8 pillars positioned around a central shaft, unevenly spaced like broken teeth in a jaw. On the corner of one blueprint, someone had scribbled in pencil, "Ocho nails removed, no stabilization required. Proceed." I felt a chill. He went back the next morning. Mrs. Nora wasn't there. Her shop was locked. The glass was fogged from the inside. Archie took the elevator to the restricted floor, the 5th. The doors opened to nothing but gray light and an empty hallway. The air pressed against him, heavy and stale. And then he heard breathing, not his own, slow, labored, like something old exhaling from the walls. A man sat slumped by the railing, the night guard, his eyes wide open, pupils trembling. Archie crouched. "Sir, are you all right?" The man shook his head. "They don't jump, sir." "What do you mean?" "They're pushed. Not by hands, by hunger." Archie frowned. "You mean they felt compelled?" The guard looked up at him, tears streaking his face. "They hear it first, the whisper. It says the same thing every time." Archie's throat went dry. "What does it say?" "A dragon's molar needs a meal." There was a low moan, deep and hollow, like the sound of metal twisting under weight. Archie stepped back. The guard's hands were shaking. He stood, backed up toward the railing as if dragged by invisible threads. "Don't," Archie said. The man's voice broke. "It's hungry again." Then silence. The breath. A single word. Barely more than a sigh. "Feed." The guard fell. Archie never saw him hit the ground, but the sound echoed up the stairwell like thunder. By the next day, the 5th floor was sealed again. Archie filed his report. He wrote what they wanted to hear, that the site was safe, that the accidents were psychological, that fear spreads like mold in closed spaces. But when he left the building, he couldn't shake the sound of that whisper. Not from the guard, not from the air, from the marble itself. He returned home, but the apex didn't leave him. In dreams, he saw 8 white teeth rising from the ground, blood seeping between them like ink, and in one of those dreams, or maybe it wasn't, he walked past the apex again. The windows glowed faintly. Music drifted from inside. Laughter, clinking glasses, a party in full swing. But the building was empty. He knew it. Everyone knew it. Still, the sound grew louder as he walked by. Voices echoing through the marble halls. A toast, a laugh, a whisper. A dragon's molar needs a meal. He didn't look back, but he could feel the eyes from those upper floors watching, waiting, counting. The next morning the storm had passed, but the sky above Willow Creek remained heavy and bruised with gray. The rain had washed away the dust on the streets, leaving behind puddles that reflected the warped outlines of the decaying buildings. Lydia walked to town in her old coat, clutching the yellow envelope from her aunt's drawer, the one marked, "Do not open." She hadn't opened it yet. Not out of obedience, but fear. There was something final about the way her aunt's handwriting pressed into the paper, as if it wasn't just a message, but a warning written from the other side of understanding. She had spent most of the night hearing things again. The same whispering hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the old Willow house. It wasn't quite a voice, not quite a sound, but something in between. Something that watched. That morning, as she passed the church at the edge of town, a man in a brown hat stepped out from behind the stone gate. He was small and crooked in stature, his eyes sharp and black as coal. His coat was the same dull color as the mud beneath their feet. "Miss Lydia Bell?" he asked, tipping his hat politely. She froze. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," he said with a thin smile. "But I knew your aunt, Mrs. Willow. She called me before she passed." Lydia felt her stomach tighten. "Called you for what?" "For advice," he said simply. "The land under that house of hers, it's not right. She wanted me to take a reading." "A reading?" Lydia frowned. "You mean like," he interrupted softly, "a geomantic consultation? You may call it old superstition, but your aunt did not." There was something in his tone that made her hesitate. The man introduced himself as Mr. Wu, a geomancer who had worked in the town for decades. He looked out toward the fog-covered hills and said, almost to himself, "Willow Creek used to be fertile ground, but that house sits on a dead vein. Too much water, too much metal, not enough fire to cleanse." Lydia had no idea what he meant, but she followed him anyway when he gestured for her to walk. The road wound past the mill and up toward the northern ridge, where the house stood like a wounded animal watching the town below. The closer they got, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, just the low hum of the wind brushing through the trees. Mr. Wu stopped at the old gate and placed his hand on the wooden post. His face hardened. "There's been a shift," he murmured. "The ground here doesn't breathe anymore." Lydia's skin prickled. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer at first. He simply reached into his coat and drew a small brass compass. The needle spun slowly, erratically, before settling not north but directly toward the house. Mr. Wu frowned. "Your aunt was warned. She knew the lay of the land was broken, but she stayed." "Why?" Lydia asked, almost whispering, because something in there asked her to. The words hit like ice. Lydia forced a laugh. "You mean ghosts? Spirits? That's ridiculous." "Anne," he looked at her, his eyes strangely calm. You don't have to believe in them for them to believe in you. They walked to the porch. The door groaned open on its own, and for a moment, Lydia thought she saw movement inside a flicker of reflection where no mirror should have been. Mr. Wu's steps slowed as they entered. He moved methodically, scanning corners, walls, the ceiling. This place has 4 centers of disturbance, he said. One beneath the hearth, one under the staircase, one in the west room, and one near the old mirror upstairs. At the mention of the mirror, Lydia's breath hitched. She hadn't told him about it. The tall, cracked mirror in her aunt's bedroom that seemed to catch her shadow even when she wasn't standing in front of it. "How do you know about that?" she whispered. Mr. Wu didn't answer. He just took a folded paper charm from his pocket, pressed it against the wall, and began to hum under his breath. The sound made the floorboards vibrate faintly, like the whole house was listening. Then a creak. The mirror upstairs gave a faint, ringing noise, like glass sighing. Mr. Wu stopped chanting and turned to Lydia. His face had gone pale. "You need to leave this place by tonight." "What? Why?" "Because the spirit your aunt bound here is awake. It has been fed too long on grief." End of term. Lydia's mind spun. "That's impossible. Aunt Willow wasn't some witch. She was desperate," Mr. Wu interrupted. "She lost her son here, didn't she?" Lydia hesitated. "Yes, Sam. He drowned in the creek. Years ago." Mr. Wu nodded grimly. She tried to call him back, but it wasn't Sam who answered. The silence between them grew heavy, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. "She didn't raise her boy," he continued. "She raised what wore his memory." That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the unopened envelope, staring at the name scrawled across it. "To Lydia, only if you see him again." Her hands trembled. She tore the seal. Inside was a single page, her aunt's handwriting uneven, frantic. "If you see Sam after dark, do not speak to him. He is not what you remember. He will ask you to come closer. He will smile like he used to. Do not let him touch you." Lydia's pulse quickened. She stood and looked toward the staircase. The air upstairs shimmered faintly, as if a light was moving behind the door of Sam's old room. Her breath came shallow. She climbed. At the top step, she saw it. The faint silhouette of a boy, sitting cross-legged on the floor, his back turned toward her. The same small frame, the same brown hair. "Sam?" she whispered. He turned. The smile was perfect, familiar, boyish, warm, but his eyes reflected no light. They were 2 mirrors, endless and hollow. "Lydia," he said softly. "Aunt Willow said you'd come back." Lydia's legs almost gave out. "You're not—" "Don't say that." The voice trembled. "You left me here." She stepped back, shaking her head. "Sam died. You're not real." He tilted his head. "Aunt Willow promised she'd fix everything. She promised she'd keep me here. But you have to help me finish it." "Finish what?" The air flickered again, like static. His skin began to pale, not with death, but with reflection silvering over, as though turning to glass. "Break the mirror," he whispered, "or it will take another." Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished, leaving only a faint handprint on the floor, shining faintly in the dark. When morning came, Lydia ran to Mr. Wu's small shop in town. She found him sitting cross-legged behind the counter, surrounded by open books and paper charms. "You saw him," he said quietly, before she even spoke. Lydia nodded. "He told me to break the mirror." Mr. Wu's expression darkened. "That's how it begins. It wants you to think you're helping, but breaking the mirror won't destroy it. It will release it." His stomach dropped. "Then what do I do?" He looked up, eyes heavy with something like pity. "You cannot destroy it. You can only move it. Contain it." Your aunt tried. That was her mistake. She used her bloodline as the seal. "You mean—" Lydia's voice cracked. "It's bound to me now." Mr. Wu nodded. "That's why I called you back." That night, Lydia didn't return to the Willow house. She sat in a motel room at the edge of town, trembling, unable to sleep. But at 3:14 a.m., her phone vibrated. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "Sam, it's cold here. Can you come home?" Her phone slipped from her hand. The screen dimmed, and in its reflection, for just a heartbeat, she saw him standing behind her, smiling through the glass. By the third day, Lydia stopped pretending she could stay away. Every road out of Willow Creek felt longer than before, and somehow, all of them seemed to lead back to the same hill, the one where the willow house waited like an open wound. She could feel its pull even from miles away. The silence around that house wasn't natural. It was magnetic. The geomancer's words echoed in her mind. You cannot destroy it. You can only move it, contain it. But how do you contain something that has your brother's face? Lydia returned just before dusk. The sun was sinking behind the ridge, and the house was swallowed by shadow. She hesitated at the gate, her fingers brushing over the wood scarred with deep, thin carvings, spirals, symbols, perhaps wards, long faded by time and weather. She hadn't noticed them before. When she stepped through, the air thickened immediately. The smell of damp wood and old flowers hung heavy in her throat. Every breath felt like inhaling through a shroud. Inside, the house seemed darker than it should have been. The curtains had been torn away, yet no light reached the hall. Only the mirror in the upstairs room gleamed faintly. Visible even from the bottom of the staircase, a shard of dim silver, waiting. Lydia's reflection caught in it for a moment. She was pale, thinner than she remembered, and her eyes looked wrong. Not tired, not frightened, just slightly delayed, like the reflection was watching her half a second too late. She turned away quickly, gripping the railing. "It's just trauma," she muttered under her breath. "Just nerves. None of this is real." But even as she said it, she could feel something breathing between the walls, the faint, rhythmic hum that had haunted her since the night her aunt died. It wasn't the wind. In the kitchen, she found the remnants of her aunt's rituals. Salt scattered around the threshold, half-melted wax on the counter, and a single string of paper talismans burned at the edges. Each one bore a single black symbol, smeared with what looked like old blood. There was also a note pinned to the wall with a knife. The mirror must not see itself. Lydia frowned. The note was unsigned, but she knew that handwriting thin, deliberate, the same as on the letter in the envelope. Her aunt's. "The mirror must not see itself," she murmured. She turned the phrase over and over, trying to make sense of it. Upstairs, the floor creaked a soft, deliberate weight, shifting near the bedroom. Her pulse jumped. She ascended the stairs slowly, each step betraying her with a groan. The air grew colder, heavier. When she reached the top, the door to her aunt's room stood slightly open. The mirror stood inside, taller than a man, framed in dark wood carved with unfamiliar symbols. It had been draped once. She could see the torn shreds of cloth at the corners, but the fabric now lay crumpled on the floor. The glass shimmered faintly, as if it was alive, breathing in rhythm with the house. Lydia stepped closer. Her reflection stared back. Only it wasn't her. The figure in the mirror looked identical, but the eyes were black pools, depthless, and the corners of its mouth twitched with something that wasn't quite a smile. Lydia whispered, "Sam?" The reflection tilted its head. Then it blinked once, too slowly, and in a voice soft as dust, it answered, "You came back." Lydia stumbled back, hitting the dresser. "You're not him." "Him? Does it matter?" The reflection's voice trembled through the air, both inside and outside her skull. "You left us. You left her." Her throat tightened. "Aunt Willow made a mistake. She tried to bring you back, but she didn't know what she was doing." She knew exactly what she was doing. It hissed, and for the first time, the reflection moved closer. The glass rippled like water. "She promised she would never let me fade. She promised you would come home." Lydia could barely breathe. "What are you?" "I'm what's left of her wish," the thing said. "And you're the price." Then the reflection smiled wider, too wide, splitting from ear to ear. The mirror's surface shuddered. A hairline crack spread across it with a sound like bone breaking. Lydia screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The house groaned deep, low, almost human. The lights flickered, and then the mirror laughed. Not loudly, but softly, like a child whispering behind their hand. When she awoke, it was dark. She was lying on the floor beside the mirror. Her head throbbed. She must have fainted. But something was wrong. The air felt reversed, as if the room itself were inside out. Shadows leaned the wrong way. Sounds came from places that didn't exist. And in the mirror, the crack had spread further. The shape of her reflection was distorted now, longer, thinner, but the eyes were sharper, hungrier. "Lydia," it whispered, though her lips didn't move. "You can't leave. You belong here now." She scrambled to her feet and ran to the door. It didn't open. Her reflection smiled. "The door's on my side now." Then, impossibly, the thing stepped forward. Its hand pressed against the inside of the glass and the surface began to bend outward like stretched fabric. A faint outline of fingers pushed through, glistening like mercury. Lydia screamed and threw the nearest object, a porcelain lamp, at the mirror. The glass shattered. For a moment, there was silence, then a sound like air being sucked out of the world. The walls groaned. The temperature dropped until her breath came out in clouds. From the broken shards, something began to crawl, not a shadow, not a ghost, but a reflection without source. A moving darkness, shaped vaguely like a person dripping light instead of blood. It stood up, faceless, yet she could feel it looking at her. "Why did you break it?" The voice came from everywhere at once. "Now I have to find another." Lydia stumbled backward, tripping over the rug. "Stay away!" The shadow tilted its head, almost curiously. "You freed me." She grabbed a shard of mirror from the floor and held it out like a weapon. The reflection inside it, her reflection, smiled at her, calm and cruel. "You can't fight your own shape," it whispered. "You made me real." Then the lights went out. Lydia ran. She didn't think. She just ran. Down the stairs, through the hallway, into the yard. The cold air hit her lungs like knives. When she looked back, she saw it standing in the upstairs window, watching her. Her own shape, her own face, framed in the broken light of the house. It didn't move. It didn't have to. The whisper carried through the night air. The mirror must not see itself. Lydia froze. She turned slowly toward the old well behind the house, the one sealed with a wooden cover. A plan formed in her mind, wild and desperate. She ran back inside, grabbed the heavy frame of the broken mirror, and dragged it toward the door. Every inch it moved, the air pulsed harder, as if the house itself was fighting her. She reached the porch, breathless. "Let me go," she hissed at the air. "You had Aunt Willow. You can't have me." No response. Only the low hum again, growing louder. She lifted the mirror and shoved it toward the well. The reflection inside her reflection screamed. Not from the glass, but from inside her skull. "You'll drown us both," it cried. Lydia gritted her teeth, tears running down her face. Then so be it. With one final shove, the mirror slipped. It crashed into the darkness below, the sound echoing for what felt like forever, before fading into silence. She stood there for a long time, trembling. The night was quiet again. Too quiet. Finally, she turned to go. But as she walked toward the gate, she noticed something strange. Her shadow, faint under the moonlight, didn't match her steps. When she stopped, it moved. When she turned, it didn't. And then, very softly, it smiled. Lydia hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel the house breathing. Not the Willow house itself anymore. That ruin was miles away now, but something inside her, something that inhaled when she exhaled, that blinked when she tried to hold her gaze. Sometimes, when she looked in the mirror of her rented motel bathroom, the woman staring back blinked too late. She had begun covering every reflective surface she could find with towels, aluminum foil, whatever she could tape up. Still, the whisper found her. It came from dark corners, from puddles on the street, from the dull gleam of the metal faucet. The mirror must not see itself. She couldn't escape that phrase. The geomancer's workshop sat on the outskirts of Chinatown, hidden behind a shuttered herbal store. By the time Lydia found it, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely knock. The door opened before she could. "You brought it back with you," the old man said. His eyes were clouded, but his face remained stern, measured. "I warned you, child. The dragon's lines run deep. You cannot simply walk away." "I didn't mean to," Lydia said, her voice trembling. "I broke it. I threw it down the well. I thought that would stop it." He shook his head slowly. "When a mirror breaks, its truth scatters. You didn't destroy it. You multiplied it." Her breath caught. "What does that mean?" "It means," the geomancer said, motioning her inside, "you've become the vessel." The interior was dim, lit only by candles and an oil lamp that seemed to flicker in unnatural rhythm. Shelves were lined with jars of ash, folded talismans, and pieces of old jade cracked down the middle. Lydia sat down, clutching her hands. "Can you take it out of me?" He studied her quietly, then placed a small copper mirror between them on the table. Its surface was dull, ancient. "Look," he said. She hesitated. "I can't," she whispered. "Look." So she did. At first, she saw nothing but her reflection, pale and gaunt. But then, behind her shoulder, something darker appeared. A shimmer, a suggestion of shape, tall and faceless. Its outline pulsed faintly, like a second heartbeat. Her throat tightened. "It's there." "Yes," the geomancer said quietly. "It's attached to your reflection, the echo left behind when you shattered the binding glass. Every mirror is a doorway. You've been leaving pieces of yourself open." He closed the copper mirror with the silk cloth, sealing it. "There is a way," he continued, "but it will hurt. To seal it, we must make a mirror of your own blood." Lydia froze. "What are you talking about?" He pointed toward the symbols carved into his table, 8 intersecting circles forming a spiral. "Blood recognizes the soul. Ink cannot hold what is crossed between worlds." "No." She wanted to protest, but the whisper came again, faint, almost gentle, curling from the dark corner of the room. "You can't stop what's yours." Lydia turned toward the sound, but nothing was there. She pressed her trembling hand to her chest. "Do it," she said. "Just do it." The ritual began just before dawn. The geomancer worked in silence, mixing crushed cinnabar, salt, and black ink into a shallow bowl. He then pricked her palm and let the blood drip into the mixture. The moment it touched, the ink shivered like something alive. He drew a circle on the floor around her, then placed a small bronze mirror in the center. "This is the seal," he said. "You must face it and speak your name. But once begun, you cannot stop until it answers." What if it doesn't?" she asked. "Then the reflection will speak for you." The air thickened. The candles flickered violently. Lydia knelt, her knees weak, and stared at the bronze mirror. At first, she saw only her pale face reflected dimly. Then, the image began to ripple, as though the metal itself were liquid. The whisper returned louder this time, but layered, like 2 voices overlapping. "Lydia, you tried to bury me. Go back," she said softly. "You're not real. I'm the part you left behind." Her reflection's mouth began to move, though she hadn't spoken. The voice from the mirror was hers, but stretched, distorted. "You ran," it said. "You left the house, but the house never left you." Lydia's breath quickened. "You're nothing but—" The mirror's surface flared white, cutting her off. The reflection reached out from within the metal, its hand twisting through like smoke. The geomancer began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic, each word resonating deep in her chest. The symbols around the circle glowed faintly. Lydia gritted her teeth, forcing the words out. "My name is Lydia Willow. You are not me." The reflection laughed. The sound made her vision blur. "You don't even believe that anymore." The air seemed to press inward. The room bent around them, She felt something cold wrap around her spine, dragging her closer to the mirror. The geomancer's chant grew louder. "Do not listen. Speak your name again." Her eyes watered. "Lydia Willow." The reflection smiled a terrible, knowing curve. "Then why are we the same?" Her vision flickered. For an instant, she saw herself kneeling on the floor, small, trembling, covered in sweat. Then the world snapped back. Blood began to run from her nose. The geomancer shouted a final word, a sharp crack in the air, and the circle erupted in light. The reflection screamed, twisting violently as if being ripped apart by invisible hands. The bronze mirror cracked down the center, spilling black smoke into the air. Then silence. Lydia collapsed forward, gasping. The old man put a trembling hand on her shoulder. "It's done," he said. "The seal is complete. It will no longer follow you." But Lydia didn't answer. She was staring at the floor, her eyes unfocused. "Child?" Slowly, she raised her head. Her lips curved upward, just slightly. And then, in a voice not her own, she whispered, "You sealed the wrong one." The lamp went out. The geomancer stumbled backward, clutching the table for balance. The air grew thick, electric. "Show yourself," he demanded, though his voice trembled. "What have you done?" Lydia stood, her posture unnaturally still. When she looked at him, her pupils had vanished. "The seal works," she said, her tone calm, detached. "But every lock needs a key." He began tracing symbols in the air, muttering protective words. "Release her." "I can't," she said. "I am her." And the shadows around the room lengthened, twisting upward like smoke. The jars on the shelves began to rattle. The bronze mirror, cracked and dark, started to hum, faintly at first, then louder, vibrating against the floor. The geomancer's voice rose. "Return to where you came from." Lydia took a step closer. "I did return. You brought me back." Her reflection, faint but visible in the broken mirror, was smiling. The air snapped like a struck chord. Then everything went black. When Lydia woke again, the sun was high. The workshop was empty. The shelves were overturned, papers scattered across the floor. The geomancer was gone. In the center of the circle lay the bronze mirror, now whole again, polished and gleaming as if it had never cracked. Lydia crawled toward it, her hands trembling. She could see her reflection clearly now. Her own eyes, her own face, calm, still. And behind her the faint outline of the old man, standing perfectly still, his expression blank, his throat dark with shadow. She turned, but there was no one there. When she looked back at the mirror, the reflection of the geomancer raised its hand and smiled. Then the glass darkened, like a lid closing over an eye. Lydia left the workshop that evening. She didn't look back. In her pocket, she carried the small bronze mirror wrapped in cloth. She told herself she was taking it to dispose of it, to bury it far from any reflective surface. But part of her knew better. When she caught a reflection in the window of a passing car, it mouthed something she couldn't hear, but she recognized the shape of the words. The mirror must not see itself. The temple burned red against the night sky. Flames licked the ancient pillars, throwing monstrous shadows that danced along the cracked statues of forgotten gods. May stumbled through the smoke, clutching the jade talisman that Master Yun had given her, the only thing still warm from his touch. Her lungs screamed. Every breath carried the taste of ash and blood. Somewhere behind her, the mountain groaned. It was not an earthquake this time. It was the dragon waking. It had been sealed beneath Mount Luoshan for nearly 8 centuries. The villagers called it Long Hun, the Soul Eater. According to the temple's records, it was once a guardian spirit until men built shrines and sacrificed innocents to feed its hunger. When the ritual was finally broken, the creature's rage cursed the entire valley with misfortune and death. Now, after decades of silence, it had begun to stir again. May reached the inner sanctum, coughing violently. The air shimmered with heat, and the golden murals of dragons seemed alive, writhing, hissing, whispering. In the center stood the mirror from Part 3, its surface now cracked like ice, dripping with black sap. Her hands trembled. The geomantic lines that Master Yun had drawn across the floor were scorched away, the salt circles broken. Only one symbol remained, the Hun rune, the one meant to trap the dragon's soul. But the rune was pulsing, like a heartbeat. Master Yun, Mai screamed, her voice breaking. There was no answer, only the groan of collapsing beams and the flutter of charred paper charms. She moved deeper, the sound of her footsteps echoing strangely. Each step seemed delayed, as if the world was repeating itself 1 second too late. Her reflection in the cracked mirror followed, but not perfectly. It blinked slower. Its mouth twisted before hers did, and then it smiled. You broke the seal, the reflection whispered. The voice wasn't hers, it was deeper, trembling with hunger. You brought me home. May staggered back, clutching the talisman. No, you were sealed centuries ago. I'm here to restore the ward. The reflection's eyes glowed crimson. You can't restore what you were part of. She froze. Then she noticed it. Her shadow. It wasn't her own anymore. The shape stretching along the floor wasn't human. It had horns, scales, and a long, serpentine tail that twitched like it was alive. Master Yun had warned her about this. The dragon feeds not on flesh, but on will, he'd said. When you accept its curse, you become its mouthpiece. But she hadn't believed him. Not when her family's fortune vanished. Not when her father fell ill. She had begged the dragon for mercy, and it had listened. The temple doors exploded inward. Wind rushed through like 1,000 invisible claws. The flames bent backward, sucked into the vortex that formed above the altar. Something massive began to take shape. It was not a body, but a hunger made visible, shimmering scales of smoke and blood. Its head, crowned with jagged bone, emerged from the cracks in the mirror. Eyes that looked older than time fixed on her. Feed her, it hissed. You carried my hunger well. May fell to her knees. The talisman burned against her chest, the jade glowing brighter with every pulse. I didn't mean to, she gasped. I just wanted to save them. The dragon laughed, the sound like an avalanche. Save them? You fed me their prayers, their pain, their souls. Every ritual, every plea, it was all for me. She remembered the years of offerings, the prayers written on silk, the smell of incense, the way each ceremony seemed to take something invisible from the villagers. Their eyes grew duller each season, their children weaker, and yet their crops flourished, their gold multiplied. The dragon had been eating through her, disguising its feast as blessing. She looked down at her hands. The skin had begun to darken, veins tracing up her arms like ink. No, she whispered. I won't let you use me. The dragon's voice filled her head. You are already me. Pain exploded through her chest. Her bones twisted, her spine arched backward. Her scream echoed like metal tearing apart. The jade talisman shattered, releasing a sound like 1,000 bells breaking at once. Through the agony, she saw Master Yun, his spirit form, translucent and fading, standing by the altar. May, he shouted. The seal must be completed. You must end it with blood. The dragon roared, shaking the mountain. He lies. His kind imprisoned me. You were born to release me. Her vision blurred. Two voices fought within her Yun's command and the dragon's promise. One offered peace through death. The other offered immortality through surrender. And then she saw it. A small clay bowl rolling near her feet. It was one of the ritual vessels, the one meant for the sealing sacrifice. Inside, the ashes of her family's names still glowed faintly. Tears fell down her cheeks. I'm sorry, Father, she whispered. She plunged her hand into the ashes. The floor erupted in blue fire. Runes burst alive, circling her like living chains. The dragon howled, its body tearing through the sanctum walls as the symbols dragged it back toward the mirror. You cannot bind what you've become, it screamed. Her skin burned away, revealing scales of light beneath. For a moment, she saw herself reflected in the mirror. Half woman, half dragon. Her eyes were both human and ancient. Then she smiled. You're right. She stepped into the mirror. The explosion shook the entire valley. The temple collapsed. The flames extinguished in an instant. When the villagers climbed the mountain the next morning, they found nothing but ash and a single mirror standing upright in the crater. Its surface was flawless, unbroken, but in its depths, if one stared long enough, a pair of eyes sometimes blinked back. Years passed. The legend of Mount Luashon became a local ghost story, told to children to keep them from wandering into the old ruins. But every few years, on the night when the moon turned red, strange flowers would bloom along the crater's edge, scales of jade growing from stone. Those who dared to touch them claimed to hear whispers. They said the flowers spoke a name, May. And in the silence that followed, if the wind was right, one could hear a faint hiss, like a sleeping creature beneath the earth, still hungry, still waiting. The unkindness of fire. The air in the interrogation room felt dry, like static trapped between four concrete walls. Detective Clara Vaughn sat opposite a man who looked as if someone had drained all the color out of him. His name was Leonard Davies, owner of a once profitable textile factory on the west end of town now. Nothing more than a pile of ash and twisted steel. He rubbed his thumb against the table's metal edge, leaving a faint streak of sweat every time he did it. His eyes refused to settle anywhere for too long. When they met hers, it was only for a flicker, like a match sputtering out before it could light. You were there when the fire started. Clara's voice was steady, low. Davies nodded slowly. I was in my office. Sarah was downstairs. She said she was staying late to finish the inventory sheets. She often worked late, only when I asked her to. That pause was too deliberate, Clara thought. Too controlled for a man who just watched his entire factory burn down. She opened the folder in front of her. Inside, charred photographs of the site, blackened beams, melted frames, and one image of a body-shaped shadow in the middle of the room, or what was left of it. The coroner says there was no accelerant found, she said. No gas, no oil, no chemical traces. I told them, Davies muttered, his fingers trembling near his lips. She just went up, like paper. Clara didn't blink. She caught fire without a source. That's what I said. Do you expect me to believe that? He stared at her then, the faint light in his eyes hardening into something defensive. I don't expect you to believe anything, Detective. I'm just telling you what I saw. Clara leaned back in her chair, studying him. Every time she dealt with arson cases, there was always a pattern, a spark, a motive, a cause. Fires didn't just happen, not like this. And people didn't just burst into flames without reason. Tell me again, she said quietly. From the beginning. He sighed. The sound uneven, caught halfway between fear and exhaustion. We'd been running late shipments all month. The investors were breathing down my neck. Sarah stayed after hours. She said she didn't mind. She liked the quiet. I told her I'd grab us some food. He stopped. His hand had started tapping the table in an irregular rhythm. When I came back, he said, I smelled something sweet. Not smoke, not oil. Sweet. Like burnt sugar. I went downstairs and saw her, standing there. Just standing. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't moving. And then, his voice cracked. Then she started burning. Clara's pen hovered over her notebook. You mean she was on fire? She was, he whispered. Her skin, it was glowing from the inside. I didn't see any flames around her. It was like the fire was inside her. He looked up suddenly, meeting her gaze with desperation. There was no scream, Detective, not one. She didn't even try to move. She just accepted it. The silence that followed stretched thin across the room. Clara could hear the faint hum of the old ceiling fan above them. Davy's breathing had gone shallow, erratic. You're saying she combusted spontaneously? Yes. Do you even believe that? I didn't, he said. Until that night. Clara scribbled something in her notes. His story didn't match the burn pattern, it never would. A spontaneous human combustion case? That was tabloid nonsense. Still, the fire inspector had noted something strange. The walls were untouched. The surrounding papers, the desk, even the wooden floor beneath the chair, all unscathed. Only Sarah's body had burned, reduced to black residue and a faint, oily stain on the concrete. She flipped to another page. How long had Sarah been working for you? 2 years. Good worker? The best. Any problems between you two? His eyes narrowed. What kind of problems? Personal ones. He laughed once dry, humorless. No, she wasn't that kind of employee. Why? Yet you asked her to stay late. Repeatedly. Davies exhaled, leaning forward now. You're trying to make me into something I'm not. I'm trying to understand why a woman died in your factory. I told you why. Because something unnatural happened. Clara didn't react. She waited for the anger to exhaust itself. It did, like a match burning down to a nub. He slumped again, rubbing his temples. She closed the folder. Mister Davies, you mentioned smelling something sweet before you saw her. Could it have been chemicals? Something leaking from the fabric storage? He shook his head. No. We'd cleared all flammable materials. Everything was locked up. Any gas line near her desk? No. Any electrical faults? No, he whispered. I checked everything myself. Then maybe, Clara said softly, you missed something. He looked up sharply. Like what? Like the truth. And, for a long time, neither of them spoke. Clara watched him fidget. Sweat had gathered near his collar, darkening the fabric of his shirt. His hands, once steady, were now shaking. Finally, she pushed a small photograph across the table. It showed a close-up of a burned wrist. Around it a faint circle, unburned, where a bracelet had been. You said she didn't scream, Clara said. So you didn't try to help her? I couldn't, he said weakly. The heat was too much. You don't understand, she wasn't on fire like a normal flame. It was... He searched for the word, his mouth trembling. Hungry. Hungry? He nodded, his voice dropping. It was like the fire wanted to eat the truth out of her. The words made something stir in Clara. Not fear, curiosity. A subtle, uneasy kind of fascination. The truth, she repeated. What truth? Davies didn't answer. He just stared down at his shaking hands, as if afraid of what they might reveal next. Hours later, when the interview ended, Clara sat alone in the observation room replaying the audio. Davies' voice came through the speakers, distorted by static. Wanted to eat the truth? The phrase echoed again and again. She stopped the recording and rubbed her temples. The fluorescent light above her flickered. She hated this building, its smell of rust and old paper, the way the shadows always seemed to lean toward the sound of a voice. Her partner, Lieutenant Marsh, entered with 2 cups of coffee. You've been at it 3 hours, he said. Get anything useful? Depends on what you call useful. She took the coffee and gestured toward the tape. He says she burned from the inside out. Marsh frowned. So? Another lunatic's story. Maybe. But the lab confirmed something strange. The burn residue had no trace of accelerant, and the temperature reading from the scene was abnormally high, over 3,000 degrees. And Marsh whistled. That's impossible. So is a woman turning to ash in 30 seconds. He sat down beside her. You think he killed her? I think he's hiding something. Whether or not he struck the match himself, he knows why she died. And, the spontaneous combustion thing? Convenient myth. It's easier to say she caught fire by herself than admit what really happened. Marsh tilted his head. And what do you think really happened? Clara stared through the glass at the empty interrogation chair where Davies had Saturday. I think guilt burns hotter than gasoline. Marsh gave a low hum. You're starting to sound like one of those occult freaks. Maybe they just noticed what science refuses to name. Outside the room, a janitor pushed his cart past, humming softly. The air smelled faintly of bleach, sharp, sterile, unforgiving. Clara took another sip of coffee, but it had gone cold. She didn't mind. Her thoughts were burning hotter than anything in that cup. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the scene as Davies described it. Sarah standing still, skin glowing, eyes open, no scream, no resistance, only fire and silence. Something about it didn't feel random, it felt intentional, like confession through combustion. At dawn, Clara stood outside the ruins of the textile factory. The structure was skeletal, hollowed out. Char marks climbed the brick walls like veins. A light fog drifted through the debris, muting the edges of what once was. She crouched near the place the body had been found. The concrete was stained in a rough oval, black at the center and fading to pale gray. In the middle, a single fragment of glass, melted and warped. Maybe part of a window, maybe something else. She picked it up carefully, holding it against the light. For a brief second, she thought she saw a reflection, a woman's outline, faint and burning. She blinked. It was gone. Behind her, Marsh called out, "You're wasting your time, Vaughn. Place is clean. No evidence left." "Everything leaves something," she said softly. She tucked the fragment into an evidence bag and turned toward the rising Sunday. Its light caught the ash particles floating in the air, and for a moment, the world looked like it was quietly burning. Somewhere deep in her chest, something told her this was only the beginning. The next morning, Clara found herself standing inside the Metropolitan Institute of Applied Paranormal Physics. It was a sterile building, too clean, too white. The kind of place that made grief and fear feel like impurities that didn't belong. The hum of electricity filled the air, and every few seconds, a red light blinked somewhere deep in the corridor, marking the pulse of a machine. Dr. Anya Volkova greeted her with a calmness that was almost unnerving. The woman looked like she had been pulled straight from a lab manual sharp white coat, hair tied neatly back, pale fingers that moved with precision. "You're the detective, yes?" she said, her accent crisp, the trace of Eastern Europe curling around her vowels. "Detective Clara Monroe," Clara replied. "I'm investigating the fire at the Davies factory. The man insists it was spontaneous human combustion." Anya's brow lifted slightly, as though amused. "He's not the first." She motioned toward a small room filled with glass panels and data screens. There were photographs pinned to a corkboard, charred outlines of bodies in unburned surroundings, autopsy notes, temperature readings, timestamps. Every image looked too strange to belong in a rational world. Clara stepped closer to one photo, the image of Sarah. The woman was reduced to a black, twisted shape in her office chair, the floor untouched. Her laptop melted like wax. "She was his secretary," Clara said. "Apparently she burst into flames without a match, without gas, without reason." Anya leaned forward, studying the photo with quiet fascination. "Reason, detective, is the most fragile thing we have." She began typing on a nearby terminal, and a series of waveforms appeared, patterns of fluctuating energy fields, like ghostly fingerprints. "For decades, your kind police, detectives, journalists have blamed alcohol, fat, or cigarette embers. But this," she pointed at the screen, "is something else." Clara folded her arms. "You think this is supernatural?" Anya gave a small, knowing smile. "Not supernatural. Subnatural. Something buried beneath human nature itself." She led Clara deeper into the lab, past tanks filled with strange blue vapor in a glass chamber that hummed faintly. Inside, a mannequin sat upright, its torso connected to dozens of electrodes. "We've been studying energy discharges from the human body," Anya explained. "Mostly harmless heat, static, bioelectric residue, but in rare cases, we find what we call negative soul energy, NSE for short." Clara frowned. "That sounds like something from a seance." Anya didn't laugh. Every lie, every suppressed guilt, every act of hatred, these things generate emotional energy. Normally, it disperses. But when a person keeps their secrets too long, when remorse festers instead of healing, the energy condenses. It becomes a catalyst. Clara circled the chamber slowly. A catalyst for what? For ignition. Anya turned a dial. The mannequin sensors began to blink. When that energy peaks, it converts emotion into heat. A violent, uncontrollable reaction. Think of it as the body consuming itself with everything it cannot confess. Clara stared at her. You're telling me Sarah burned because she was guilty? I'm telling you she burned because she believed she was. For a moment, the silence between them was thick enough to taste. Clara watched the scientist's calm face, searching for any hint of mockery. There was none, only a quiet, obsessive certainty. People create their own hells. Anya continued softly. Sometimes their bodies catch up. Clara followed Anya into another chamber, this one colder. The air smelled faintly of ozone and alcohol. A glass container held what looked like a handful of gray ash. This was collected from another case. Anya said, a man in Bristol, 1997. He had defrauded a church charity for years. When he finally collapsed, the temperature inside his body reached over 1,000 degrees. There was no external flame, no accelerant. Clara crouched near the glass. The ash looked ordinary, innocent almost. Negative soul energy, Anya said again, as if the term had a sacred weight. The imbalance between life's truth and its deception. When it becomes too large to contain, the body becomes the wick. Clara turned to her. You said something earlier, subnatural. What does that mean? Anya smiled faintly. It means it's part of nature, but beneath our understanding, we cannot deny it. We can only witness it. As the hours passed, Clara took notes, methodical, skeptical, professional. She had seen 1,000 crime scenes, and every one of them had followed the laws of evidence. But this was something else. Could Davies be next? She asked finally. If what you're saying is true, if this energy feeds on guilt, then the man who caused this might, Anya finished the thought for her, might ignite as well. Clara felt a chill crawl up her neck. Anya looked out the window, where the city stretched beneath a gray, hazy afternoon. If you want to stop it, detective, find what he's hiding. The energy always roots itself in the lie. Clara left the institute that evening with her head pounding. She told herself it was nonsense, scientific myth wrapped in mysticism. And yet, as she walked down the marble steps into the fading light, she caught her reflection in a passing window. For a brief second, she thought she saw smoke drifting from her shoulders. When she blinked, it was gone. She exhaled, forcing herself to focus. Sarah had burned alive. Davies had lied about something. An insurance policy, a cover-up, a motive. That was what mattered. But still, Anya's voice lingered in her head, like a whisper that refused to fade. The body consumes what the soul cannot release. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The sound of the air conditioner reminded her of the lab's low hum. She sat up, rubbing her temples, then opened her laptop. She searched spontaneous human combustion and found photographs eerily similar to Sarah's case. Blackened torsos, untouched surroundings, victims found alone, sometimes sitting calmly as though unaware of their own demise. Every article tried to rationalize it, static discharge, methane buildup, cigarettes, but each explanation crumbled against the evidence. The fires burned too hot, too clean, and in every image, the victims' faces, if any remained, seemed twisted, not in pain, but in a kind of resignation, as if they had known it was coming. At 2:17 a.m., Clara's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You shouldn't have asked about Sarah. She froze. Her heart started to race. She typed back quickly. Who is this? No response. Only silence, and then a faint glow from the corner of her desk. Her lighter. She hadn't touched it in hours. Yet the metal was warm. Clara closed it, her breath shaking. She stared into the dark for a long time, her mind circling the same thought over and over. If guilt could burn, then the city was a forest waiting for its match. And maybe, just maybe, someone was already striking the first spark. The rain returned 3 nights later, soaking the ashes of the Davies factory. The building had collapsed inward, black beams jutting out like ribs from a charred carcass. A week ago, this place had been filled with noise machines, laughter, the clack of sewing needles. Now, it was silent, except for the rain. Detective Clara Monroe stood at the gate watching the smoke rise from the debris that should have long cooled. Some fires never went out. She thought especially the kind you couldn't see. Davies had called her earlier that evening. His voice trembled through the static. "Detective, they say she's still here." "Who? Sarah?" "I smell the smoke in my house. I see her shape in the reflection of the glass. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I feel heat under my skin." He hung up before Clara could answer. Now, she was here again. The mud sucking at her boots, her coat heavy with water. The air smelled like oil and something sweet. Burnt sugar, the same scent that had lingered in Sarah's office the day they found her remains. Clara moved toward the back room, the one untouched by the fire inspectors. The door was warped. The handle melted to a dull knob. She pushed through. Inside, she found Sarah's desk charred at the edges, but mostly intact. There was a single photograph on it, half burned. It showed a woman with soft eyes and tired shoulders standing next to Davies. They were smiling, but not in sync. Sarah's smile looked forced, like she was holding something back. Under the desk, a metal box. Burned at one corner, the latch rusted. Clara pried it open with her pocket knife. Inside, a stack of folded letters. They were insurance forms, all signed in Sarah's handwriting. Each document listed Davies Textiles as beneficiary, and each one contained discrepancies, altered dates, forged signatures, overwritten numbers. Clara's pulse quickened as she turned the pages. Sarah hadn't just been an employee. She'd been the architect of the fraud. At the bottom of the stack, there was one last letter sealed, unburned. It wasn't official, just handwriting, uneven and smudged with ash. "Mr. Davies, I can't do this anymore. Every night I see the numbers burning. Every time you light your cigarette, I feel the fire crawl closer. You said it was just business, that no one would get hurt, but someone always does. You told me the fire was only on paper, but it's inside me now. It won't stop. If something happens, don't say it was an accident. I'm tired of lying for you. Sarah." Clara read the words twice. The first time as an investigator, the second as a witness. She could almost hear the woman's trembling voice, her breath heavy with guilt, the words like sparks falling from her conscience. Clara drove to Davies' house that night. The storm had grown louder, the wipers squealing against the glass. She kept the letter on the passenger seat beside her, sealed in an evidence bag. When she arrived, the house was dark except for a single light in the study. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw him sitting alone, head in his hands, cigarette burning low between his fingers. He looked up when she knocked. His face was pale, hollow, slick with sweat. "Detective," he said weakly. "You shouldn't be here." "You called me," she replied, stepping in. He nodded, staring past her toward something she couldn't see. "I didn't mean to. It feels like she's still here." Clara sat opposite him. The air inside was thick with smoke, though the cigarette in his hand had gone out. "She left a letter," Clara said, placing it on the table. "You lied about the insurance, didn't you?" Davies' hand trembled. "It was her idea," he whispered. "She forged the forms, but you pushed her to do it, didn't you?" His eyes darted toward the dark hallway behind her. "I didn't force her. I told her we'd both benefit. She said she'd take the blame if it went wrong. I thought she understood." "Understood what?" "That sometimes you have to destroy something to start over." Clara leaned forward. You didn't destroy the factory, Mr. Davies. You destroyed her. He swallowed hard, and for a moment, it looked like he was about to confess everything. But then he froze. His eyes widened, staring just past Clara's shoulder. His voice cracked. "Do you smell that?" Clara turned. The faint scent of burning filled the room. Not smoke. Not wood. Something sharper. More human. Davies' skin began to glisten, beads of sweat forming across his neck and forehead. The room grew warmer so gradually it almost felt imagined. "She's angry," he whispered. "She said she'd come back. She said I'd feel what she felt." Clara stood, her hand reaching for her phone. "Mr. Davies, stay calm. You need to." "I can't." He began to shake, his eyes wild with panic. "It's inside me. I can feel it." The lights flickered. A soft hiss filled the room, like gas escaping from somewhere unseen. Davies clawed at his shirt, breathing heavily. "Help me, please." Then, the smell changed. Clara stepped back, horror slicing through her composure. His hands, his fingertips were glowing, not burning, glowing. A faint blue radiance, like static electricity crawling under his skin. "Mr. Davies," she shouted. He looked at her one last time, eyes wide with terror, and whispered, "Tell her I'm sorry." Then came the flame. It didn't explode. It bloomed softly, beautifully, almost peacefully from his chest. A quiet ignition, like the spark of a candle finding its wick. Within seconds, the fire spread up his throat, along his arms. His scream was short, cut off by a collapse of air. The heat pushed Clara backward. She stumbled against the doorframe, shielding her face. When it was over, there was silence. The room was filled with smoke, but the walls were untouched. The chair remained, the floor unmarked. Only Davies was gone, reduced to a pile of ash and a faint shimmer in the air, like the afterimage of lightning. Later, at the morgue, Clara stood before the coroner's report. There was no accelerant, no external source, no gas leak, no wiring fault. "Same as Sarah," the coroner murmured. "Burned from the inside out." Clara stared at the remains, her mind caught between reason and something darker. She thought of Anya's words. The body consumes what the soul cannot release. Maybe it wasn't science, maybe it wasn't guilt, maybe it was both two sides of the same invisible fire. When she returned home that night, she placed Sarah's letter on her desk, unfolded, next to a cup of cold coffee. The room felt colder than usual, and for a moment, she thought she saw something in the reflection of her window just behind her shoulder. A woman standing still, her outline made of smoke. Clara turned sharply. No one was there, but the faintest warmth lingered in the air, as if someone had just exhaled a final breath of flame. Rain had turned the city into a mirror. The streets gleamed under the amber streetlights, and Detective Clara Monroe walked through their reflection like a ghost who refused to fade. She hadn't slept since Davies burned. The department's internal report called it spontaneous human combustion, citing unknown internal reaction. The chief wanted the file closed. "A freak accident," he said. "We can't chase fire that doesn't leave a trace." But Clara couldn't let it go. Every time she blinked, she saw Davies' eyes, not when they were melting, but a second before that, when he looked relieved. That expression haunted her more than the fire itself. Anya met her 2 days later at the research facility outside town. The physicist looked pale, older, as if she hadn't slept either. Papers littered her desk, diagrams of human anatomy, overlaid with faint heat signatures, spectral graphs, and handwritten notes that read like prayers. Clara leaned on the counter. "You said guilt could create a kind of energy, right? A reaction between the mind and the body?" Anya nodded slowly. "It's not conventional science. But in extreme psychological states, the human body can manifest thermal energy abnormally. It's rare, almost mythical. We used to call it the fire of conscience." Clara frowned. "That sounds like folklore." Anya met her eyes. "So does every truth before someone dies for it." She showed Clara the scan reports, images taken after Sarah's death. Her body had burned entirely, yet the chair beneath her was untouched. "This," Anya said, pointing at the ghostly image, "is not combustion, it's conversion, matter transforming to energy. But something, or someone, must ignite the process." "Someone?" Clara repeated. "Emotion, guilt, fear, they are not abstract. They are chemical, electrical. When they reach a certain threshold, it's like striking a match inside the soul." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Then what about Davies? He didn't believe in guilt. He just wanted money." Anya hesitated. "Sometimes denial is the heaviest fuel." That night, Clara sat in her car outside her apartment. The rain had stopped, but she could still smell it, the scent of wet asphalt and faint smoke. She pulled Sarah's letter from her coat pocket. The ink had faded, but one line stood out under the dashboard light. "The fire isn't coming from outside anymore. It's waiting underneath." She stared at the words until her vision blurred. Underneath. Something inside her whispered, "You're not done yet." The next morning, she returned to the remains of the Davies factory. The police tape had come down, but the air still hummed with the memory of heat. Her boots crunched over soot and glass. The back office, Sarah's space, was still there. The smell of smoke was faint but constant, like perfume clinging to old fabric. She found a metal filing cabinet half buried in rubble. Inside, a photo album. The first picture, Sarah smiling, younger, sitting at a sewing machine. The second, a staff dinner. The third, the factory floor, bright, alive. And the fourth, her hand froze. It showed Davies and Sarah together in the storage room. Behind them, on the wall, were scorch marks, perfectly circular, like fingerprints of fire. The photo was dated 3 weeks before her death. She flipped it over. There was writing in blue pen. "I told him it's starting." The air around her seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, then rose again, in a pulse. She heard it before she felt it, the faint hiss of air, as though the walls were breathing. Clara turned. The shadows between the beams shimmered. Something moved. For a moment she thought it was the wind until she realized there wasn't any wind. The shape that emerged was not a person, not really. It was a silhouette of heat, transparent but distorting like a flame seen through glass. It stood exactly where Sarah's desk used to be. "Sarah?" Clara whispered. The figure tilted its head. A faint sound escaped, not speech, but a whisper of exhaled smoke. Then the air changed again, hotter, sharper. Clara's lungs tightened. She stumbled backward, eyes watering. "Sarah, please." She coughed. "What do you want?" A sound answered her, not words, but something that felt like them. "The truth burns clean." And then, silence. When she opened her eyes again, the figure was gone. Hours later, Clara found herself back at Anya's lab, shaking. Anya poured her coffee but didn't ask questions. She had the look of someone who already knew the answers. Clara placed the photo on the table. She knew it was coming. She said it started before she died. What if the fire wasn't just hers? Anya looked at the image carefully. "You mean contagious? Not the fire. The guilt." Anya set the photo down. "You believe Davies' death wasn't coincidence." End of chapter 7. "I don't believe in coincidence," Clara said. "But if this was punishment, then why am I still here?" That night, Clara's dreams burned. She was back in the interview room, but this time she was the one being questioned. The tape recorder clicked on by itself, its red light blinking like a heartbeat. A voice, hers and not hers, asked, "What did you do when you first found Sarah's body?" She remembered. She had reached for her phone, but before she called anyone, she had noticed the jewelry on the floor. A gold locket. Inside it, a photo of Sarah and a child. She had taken it for evidence, but she never returned it. "Why did you keep it?" I don't know." "You wanted to know who the child was." Clara opened the locket in her dream. The child's face stared back, pale, familiar. It was Davies' son, the boy who died in a house fire 5 years ago. Sarah had been his babysitter. Clara woke up gasping. sweat cold on her skin. The locket was still on her nightstand, its metal faintly warm. Her phone buzzed a message from Anya. "Come to the lab. I found something." When Clara arrived, Anya's face was ashen. On her monitor was a waveform of Sarah's final 911 call recovered from the factory's emergency line. The voice was distorted, frantic. He said it would be easy. He said no one would get hurt. But I can feel it. I can feel the heat under my skin. Then, static. Anya zoomed in on the last seconds. Within the noise there was another voice whispering, low, male, "You'll burn for me." Clara froze. "That's Davies." Anya nodded. "It's his voice pattern." I ran a match. Silence filled the room. The kind that hums between two hearts beating too fast. "So she didn't burn from guilt," Clara said. "She burned because of him." Anya met her gaze. "And now he's gone, burned the same way." They looked at each other. And at the same time they both whispered, "Retribution." When Clara left the lab that night, she could feel something behind her, a warmth that moved when she did. Not threatening, not yet. She walked faster, her breath fogging in the night air. At the crosswalk, she caught her reflection in a glass storefront. For a moment, she thought it was just her. Then, the reflection flickered, a faint shimmer of heat right behind her shoulder shaped like a woman. Watching, Clara turned sharply. Nothing, but the smell of smoke lingered. Back in her apartment, she poured herself a drink and sat in the dark. If guilt was fuel, then she was already burning. She thought about Sarah's last moments, the fire curling from within, the terror of realizing there was no one left to save her. And she thought about Davies' words before he died. "Tell her I'm sorry." Maybe the apology had reached her. Maybe that's why the fire had stopped there. But deep down, Clara knew the truth. Fires don't end with forgiveness. They end when there's nothing left to burn. She took out her lighter, the one she hadn't used in years, and flicked it open. The tiny flame reflected in the window. For a heartbeat, it looked like Sarah's eyes staring back. Then the flame wavered, stretched, and went out. The apartment sank into darkness. But in that darkness, she could feel it, a pulse of warmth deep inside her chest. Slow, steady, waiting. The reckoning wasn't over. It had just found its next vessel. They say guilt can weigh heavier than stone, yet burn hotter than any flame. For Clara, that truth became reality in the final days of her investigation. Every file she touched, every document she examined seemed to hum with an invisible heat, a heat that pressed against her chest and whispered that something was watching, waiting for acknowledgement. The fire that had claimed Sarah Holloway was not ordinary. It was deliberate, meticulous, a physical manifestation of the moral decay surrounding her. Clara had studied every report, spoken to every witness, retraced every step. But no theory could fully capture it. The notion of spontaneous human combustion had always felt like folklore, a tale for the uneducated. But here it was, undeniable, unavoidable, and horrifyingly precise. Clara reviewed the evidence for the last time. She ran her finger along the scorched edges of the recovered pendant, noting the tiny twists and warps in the metal, the subtle discoloration that hinted at heat beyond normal combustion. She remembered Sarah's face, pale and tense just days before her death, and the words she had whispered, almost a warning. "The fire's inside me, and it wants to leave." Clara shivered. She understood now the fire was not meant to harm everyone indiscriminately. It sought those who bore witness, those who could see the truth and do nothing. Guilt had become fuel, and the presence of another conscience nearby only intensified its hunger. She had thought herself immune, a professional observing tragedy, but she had underestimated the subtle power of acknowledgement. Hours passed. The evidence, the witness statements, the investigative notes all seemed to converge into a single point of pressure within her mind. She imagined the fire inside her own chest, a glow she could not see but could sense in her ribcage, pulsing with judgment. The more she contemplated Sarah's final moments, the more real the sensation became. In her solitude, she began to feel the creeping warmth in her fingertips, It started as an unremarkable tingling, the kind one might attribute to exhaustion, but soon it spread, crawling up her arms, an invisible flame dancing just beneath the skin. Clara knew that she had touched the pendant that had been in Sarah's possession. Somehow, the emotional residue, the burden of witness, had transferred. The fire was no longer contained. It had found her. She paced the small confines of her apartment, mind racing. The walls, the furniture, the very air seemed to carry the memory of combustion, whispering of the balance between guilt and accountability. Each step she took echoed with the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that she had seen and understood, yet could not prevent. Days blurred. Clara's thoughts became tangled with the sensation of heat that never fully dissipated. Sleep was a brief and uneasy surrender, during which she dreamed of Sarah's final moments. She saw the office engulfed in invisible flames, heard the faint crackle of a body burning from within, saw the final anguish in a face that had known fear and conscience more keenly than any living being. In these dreams, Clara realized that the fire was more than a mechanism of punishment. It was a mirror, reflecting the concealed guilt of all who stood near it. Davies had not set the flame. He had tried, yes, but it had consumed him for the sins he could not deny, the deception he carried. Sarah's death was both condemnation and revelation, a physical declaration of a moral imbalance that could not remain hidden. Clara's own reflection in the window startled her. The glass showed the woman she had been careful, analytical, detached. But beneath that surface shimmered a new awareness, a heat that could not be ignored. She had seen too much, understood too deeply. The ember that remained from Sarah's combustion had chosen its next vessel. She had become the witness, and the witness carries the weight of truth. She returned to her notes, reading and rereading the final statements. Each word, each observation, each inference seemed imbued with a latent energy, as though the truth itself carried a spark. Clara recognized that no one else could understand what had happened. The phenomenon existed at the intersection of human conscience, guilt, and something beyond the measurable world. She could describe events, record evidence, document theories, but the essence of it, the ember, would always remain elusive. Even as she prepared to submit the final report, she felt the pressure increase. The heat in her chest grew more insistent, urging acknowledgement of her own complicity, not in the act itself, but in observation without intervention. Clara realized that to understand the ember fully, she could not simply watch from a distance. She had to confront it, face the residual force that lingered like an unheeded warning, and so she did. Alone, she traced the movement Sarah had made in her final hours, imagined the sensation of the heat concentrating, of the moral energy coalescing into its inevitable culmination. Clara felt the flame within her align with the invisible embers left behind, a silent, patient fire that had waited for her attention. It demanded recognition, and in that recognition, the ember began its final work. By the end, when investigators came to search Clara's apartment, they found the place mostly intact. There were no flames, no scorched furniture, no evidence of fire in the conventional sense. Only her recorder remained, left running, its contents fragmented and distorted. In the background, faint murmurs, difficult to decipher, carried the echo of her understanding of guilt, truth, and the silent, patient justice of a fire that burns without flame. The final log entry captured the essence of her realization, a whispered testament that survived beyond her presence. The ember of conscience cannot be extinguished. It moves, it waits, it consumes those who bear witness too closely. Truth has its own weight, and some truths demand a sacrifice, not of life perhaps, but of certainty, of comfort, of innocence. And when the fire is done, when the ember has moved on, the world remains, superficially untouched, while the witness is forever changed. Clara had understood that she could never unsee what she had seen, never unfeel what she had felt. The ember had passed through her, leaving its mark in ways that no one else could perceive. The case of Sarah Holloway and the unkindness of fire ended in paperwork, reports, and legal closure. But closure is a human concept. The ember, patient as ever, continued its quiet journey, searching, observing, waiting for the next conscience to acknowledge it. And somewhere, in a quiet office, far from the scene of the original fire, the weight of witnessing burned like a final, inextinguishable ember. The binding ritual. The office of Inspector Miller smelled faintly of old paper and antiseptic. It was quiet, too quiet, as though the room itself held its breath, waiting. I had been expecting witnesses, suspects, reports, a flood of information, but the only presence was Lena. She appeared almost impossibly pale. Her skin, the delicate shade of ivory porcelain, veins faintly visible beneath the surface. Her hair hung in damp strands, and her perfume, sharp and cloying, lingered even in the sterile air, making my stomach twist in unease. She claimed to have died 2 weeks ago. That in itself was impossible, yet her voice, fragile and trembling, carried a weight that demanded attention. She spoke slowly, carefully, as though measuring each word against some unseen scale. I am dead, she whispered, eyes darting to the corners of the room as if shadows might crawl from them. My lover, he killed me. The words trembled between her lips, and in that moment, I wasn't sure whether to question her sanity or fear the truth in her confession. I took a seat across from her, notebook in hand, pen poised, though part of me suspected that writing down her words might somehow anchor them, give them permanence in a world that had no right to hold them. The air was thick, carrying a hint of the mountains she had spoken about: pine, damp soil, cold winds brushing against cliffs. She came from a tribe whose customs were alien to me, steeped in beliefs that teetered between myth and ritual, and yet there was a clarity in her eyes that was unsettling. It was a clarity that cut through pretense, seeing into the intentions of men, into the guilt and violence hidden behind smiles and hands that promised love. Her story began haltingly, fragmented, punctuated by sudden sobs that rattled the quiet office like soft stones dropped into a still pond. Jake. He was the only one I loved, she said, voice breaking. I followed him, left my family, my people, and he betrayed me. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edges of her blouse, knuckles whitening. Each gesture was small, but it spoke volumes about the tension coiled within her, a tension that had not yet dissipated despite her supposed death. I asked her to start at the beginning, and she described her life with Jake in disjointed memories that felt both real and unreal. Nights lit by candles, laughter echoing through halls, promises whispered beneath the stars, all of it now tainted by shadows. She recalled her mother's warnings, words delivered in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. Love could bind and betray. Loyalty could be twisted, and there were consequences for leaving the safety of her family. You will not die in peace, her mother had said. Your love will bind your soul to the pain of the flesh, and no mercy will untangle it. Lena's eyes, wide and fearful, lingered on mine as she spoke. It was not a story of fear alone. It was a story of inevitability, of a trap already set, and the mechanics of fate beginning to tighten. I listened, pen moving almost automatically, recording not only what she said but how she said it. The catch in her breath, the faint shiver through her arms, the way her voice sometimes floated above the words themselves, like a thread leading somewhere unseen. She spoke of the night that changed everything, the night Jake's rage became fatal. She described an argument, sharp words hurled like knives, and a sudden act of violence that left her body broken. And then, nothing, or rather everything changed. Her voice softened, almost imperceptibly as she said, and then I waited. I leaned back in my chair, uneasy. There was a calmness in her narrative that contrasted starkly with the horror of her story. She spoke of her death with a kind of clinical observation, noting the moments between breaths, the sensations of her body ceasing to obey her, the strange suspension between life and what she called the enduring period. I struggled to find words to respond, to question the reality of what I was hearing. I had interviewed many witnesses, many survivors, even perpetrators, but Lena was different. She did not plead for help or seek sympathy. She was reporting, as though the events were phenomena under scrutiny, a case study written in pain and betrayal. As the interview continued, details emerged that I could hardly believe. She explained the rituals of her people, those passed down through generations in whispers and half-remembered incantations. The enduring art, she called it. It was a method of suspending the soul, delaying death's claim just long enough to right wrongs, to ensure justice was enacted even when the world was blind. She spoke with reverence, and yet there was a coldness, an inescapable logic in her description that made the air feel heavier. It was not vengeance as one imagines in stories. It was a precise, calculated unfolding of consequence, as inevitable as dawn following night. I pressed her, seeking understanding. You mean you exist in this state by choice, or by the power of your people? She nodded, eyes glinting with an almost imperceptible light. By tradition, by necessity, and because of him. Her lips curled slightly in what might have been the barest trace of a smile, but it carried no warmth. I felt a chill, the kind that settles in your bones and refuses to leave. There was a gravity to her presence that demanded recognition. She was no longer merely a victim. She was a force, restrained by ritual, aware of its bounds, and terrifyingly patient. I asked about Jake. Her description of him was not filled with fear, though there was certainly a recognition of his guilt, but with the inevitability of his fate. He doesn't understand what he's done. He thinks he can escape consequences. Her voice dipped, almost reverential. But love, bound by death, it does not forgive. It waits. The words lingered, echoing in the empty corners of the office, leaving behind a residue of tension that pressed against my chest. I realized that I was no longer merely taking notes. I was feeling the pull of the story itself, the gravitational weight of a vengeance that transcended life. She described the last days before the ritual's effect fully took hold, the subtle indicators that the binding had begun, objects moving in small, inexplicable ways, a faint scent of her perfume in empty rooms, shadows that lingered where light should have held sway. There was a rhythm to the occurrences, a cadence that spoke not to randomness, but to orchestration. The ordinary became slightly wrong, slightly uncanny, until the world itself seemed to pause and take notice of her suspension between realms. And yet she moved among the living as though she belonged, her interactions carefully measured, never revealing the full scope of her existence. I noted how her presence affected me. Each time she spoke, I felt the pulse of something ancient, a tension in the air that reminded me that the world was not as rigidly ordered as I liked to believe. I felt small, exposed, aware of how fragile our lives are when measured against forces that are patient and precise. Lena's recounting of events made reality feel less like a solid structure and more like a thin membrane, easily pierced by the intentions of those who understood its vulnerabilities. We spoke of her people, of the rituals and beliefs that were considered archaic by most, and yet I could see the truth in the details she provided. The names of chants, the significance of symbols, the precise moments when actions must be taken or the consequences would diverge into chaos. It all created a lattice of inevitability, a framework within which justice could be administered across the divide of life and death. I realized, with growing unease, that the story she told was not a warning. It was a chronicle, a record of what had already begun to unfold. She paused often, as if listening to sounds that were inaudible to me. Sometimes her gaze drifted beyond the walls of the office, her pupils following something I could not see, and each time the hairs on my arm stood on end. It was in these silences, in these unspoken moments, that the full horror of her narrative emerged. The world was not cruel by accident. It was cruel because some forces, ancient and patient, ensured that betrayal was never left unpunished. Lena was both witness and executor, a living testament to the power of love turned into law. By the time the interview concluded, I was exhausted, drained not by the act of questioning, but by the intensity of presence. Lena rose from her chair, her movements almost unreal in their delicacy. She did not look back as she left the office, and yet I could feel the lingering weight of her story pressing against me. I understood, in that moment, that the mundane world I occupied the reports, the files, the ordinary lives of ordinary people, was not the only reality. There existed a parallel measure of consequence, precise, patient, and utterly unforgiving. Sitting alone, notebook closed, I could still hear the echo of her words, the cadence of her voice repeating in my mind. I have died, but I am not gone. And love, binds more than life can hold. It was a phrase that would haunt my dreams, intrude upon the quiet moments of my daily routines, and make me question the nature of mortality itself. For in that room, under the fluorescent lights that now seemed dim and weak, I had met a soul unbound by ordinary constraints, a presence suspended between worlds, and a story that demanded to be remembered. By the time I left the office, the city outside was quiet, streetlights glinting off wet asphalt, and a cold wind threading through the alleyways. And somewhere, beyond the reach of ordinary sight, Lena's story continued, measured, patient, and inexorably moving toward its inevitable reckoning. Miller left the city, driving up the winding mountain road, guided by Lena's vague instructions. The path twisted and climbed, seemingly hostile to any steps not accustomed to the wilderness and the mist. His old car rattled over potholes and scattered stones, but nothing unnerved him as much as the eerie silence surrounding him. No bird song, no rustling insects, only the wind whispering through the tall pines, as if the mountain itself watched, tracking every breath, every movement. When Miller finally arrived at Lena's mother's house, he sensed a peculiar energy. The house, built upon solid stone, felt off like the ground and the wind had been bent by some ancient power, shaping the air itself into unnatural currents. The dark wooden pillars and moss-covered roof seemed to have witnessed centuries of life, death, betrayal, and pain. No sound stirred within, except for a door slightly ajar, lifted by a frail but determined hand. Lena's mother appeared, tall and thin, her face lined with deep wrinkles, yet her eyes burned sharp and fathomless, penetrating everything. When she began to speak, her voice was soft, but each word carried a weight as if stones had been dropped onto the earth. "If you leave, you will not die peacefully," she said. "Your love will bind your soul to the suffering of your body. No one can save you except yourself." Miller noted each word, each measured breath, trying to comprehend. The warning was not ordinary advice. It was prophecy, validated by ancient rites passed down through generations. She recounted the ceremonies to bind spirits, methods to delay death, preventing betrayed souls from departing immediately so that justice might be served. The enduring art, she emphasized, is not a trick for the weak. It is for those with steel in their hearts, souls patient enough to await justice. She described Lena's murder at the hands of Jake, driven mad by jealousy. Immediately after her death, Lena's mother performed a secret ritual using herbs, sacred water, and ancestral incantations. Lena had not fully left the world. Her spirit lingered, suspended between life and death, capable of observing and influencing those who had wronged her. The overpowering fragrance of her presence, she explained, is not to frighten others. It is the signature of restrained decay, a bridge between two realms. Miller looked around the room. Smoke from dried herbs rose in thin spirals, mingling with the chill in the air. On the table lay small objects, silver bracelets, a worn necklace, several polished beads arranged in precise rectangles, forming a circle of energy according to the ritual. Lena's mother explained each step, the placement of items, the direction they faced, the hours of day and night necessary to stabilize the spirit. She has time, only a few weeks, to enact justice, she said. But miss a step, and it will all fail. The spirit will be powerless to intervene. Miller felt the rhythm of the ritual, not sound, but a pressing silence, the cadence of space warped by resentment and love betrayed. He asked about Jake, how he would face his punishment. Lena's mother smiled, cold and unwavering. He will not die by another's hand. What he sowed, what bound her heart, will return to him. Panic, suffering, and finally, death. Miller remembered Lena's description of being bound, not pain, but not peace. Existing without action, seeing without touching. A liminal state allowing observation and revenge, yet requiring careful adherence to the ritual. This was the art of delaying death. Liberation is not immediate. Justice is deliberate, measured, and inexorable. Her mother led Miller outside, to a circle of stones marked with ancient symbols. The wind swept through, carrying scents of burned herbs and moss, forming a natural but oppressive resonance. Here, Lena will appear if the ritual is complete, she said. No blood, no pleading is needed. Only courage and patience. It is law, not choice. Miller stood quietly, taking in the mountains and the cold wind, but the weight in the air was heavier than any physical chill. He understood then that Lena, though dead in body, remained part of a system beyond normal comprehension, a system where spirits obey justice rather than the passage of time. In that moment, Miller knew he could no longer approach the case as he would a conventional crime. Truth stretched beyond human boundaries, into a realm where spirits could delay death, manipulate from the shadows, and demand accountability from those who betrayed them. Lena's mother emphasized one final detail. The delay was not infinite. A week, a few weeks, no more. If Lena did not act within that time, if Jake evaded fear and responsibility, the ritual and justice would fail. Miller realized that, with patience and resolve, Lena would not miss her chance. The force of love, intertwined with vengeance, might move slowly, but it never forgot. Miller returned to his car, leaving the mountain behind, feeling as though he had stepped out of another world. Time no longer flowed the same. He knew that in the coming days, Jake would confront the truth Lena had orchestrated, and her spirit would fulfill unfinished business. In the quiet of the night, Miller could feel the binding and invisible tether humming through the air, a reminder that no one escapes the price of betrayal and that love can extend beyond death itself. Jake did not sleep that night. The air in his apartment felt thick, heavy with a weight he could not see but instinctively knew was there. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally. Every creak of the floor a warning. Every whisper of wind outside a reminder that he was being watched. He tried to convince himself it was paranoia, yet he could not shake the sense that Lena was near, observing, waiting. The first encounter came quietly. He thought he was alone in his bedroom when he felt a pressure behind his neck, like icy fingers pressing against his skin. Turning quickly, nothing was there, but the room felt wrong. The fragrance lingered, sweet, yet decaying. Unmistakably Lena's. Panic rose, yet it was tempered by awe. Something unnatural, deliberate, was at play. Something old, precise, bound by rules Jake did not understand. He ran through his apartment, flinging doors open, searching closets, peering under the bed, but each space was empty. Each surface held only silence. Then, in the bathroom mirror, he saw it. A shadow moving independently of him, a flicker at the corner of his eye, reflected only in the glass, not in reality. A whisper reached his ears, soft, cold. Justice does not sleep. Jake's heart hammered. His rational mind screamed that it was impossible, yet he felt the undeniable pull of Lena's presence. He stumbled down the hall, each step echoing unnaturally. The lights flickered. The scent of her lingered stronger near the living room. Objects were slightly shifted, as though the air itself had moved them. Her control was subtle, silent, terrifying in its precision. Miller's words from the mountain repeated in his mind. What she wove is law. You will confront it whether you flee or hide. Panic became adrenaline. He grabbed the front door handle, trying to escape, but the door seemed to resist, sticky and cold in his hands. A sudden draft swept in, carrying the faintest sound of a laugh, Lena's laugh, rich, distant, yet intimately close. The impossibility of it left Jake frozen for a heartbeat. until he pulled the door open and bolted into the night. Outside, the streets were empty. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the mist seemed to gather around him. He could feel it. Lena was there, shaping the environment, bending perception. Every alley appeared longer, every turn looping back as if the city itself was an extension of her will. Panic drove him forward, but he realized he was running into a trap. He had no map, no orientation, only the sensation of being drawn deeper into her sphere. He could hear faint echoes of footsteps behind him, not his own, light and deliberate, always just out of sight. Jake's rationality began to fracture. He tried to reason, to speak, to call out her name, but the air swallowed his voice. He stumbled over a curb and fell, the asphalt cutting into his hands. A fleeting shadow passed overhead, bending the darkness, vanishing before he could focus. Then a voice, soft, intimate, cold, rippled through the alley. "You will answer for what you have done." It was neither threat nor plea. It was inevitability itself. The chase intensified. Jake moved through narrow streets, alleys that seemed unfamiliar, twisting in impossible patterns. Sometimes he glimpsed her, just beyond his reach, pale as death yet radiant, eyes glowing with a ferocity that was more than anger. It was cosmic balance, a force of law beyond human comprehension. Her mouth moved, whispering words in a tongue he could not understand. Yet the meaning was clear. His life, the consequences of his acts, the debt owed. Each step brought physical exhaustion, but the weight of her presence was relentless, inexorable. At one point he found himself at the edge of a small park, overgrown and shadowed. Trees loomed like sentinels, branches reaching, twisting, as though alive. In the center, a faint glow pulsed. Jake froze. Lena appeared, floating above the ground, framed by the mist. Her eyes were pools of determination, her expression serene yet terrifyingly absolute. She did not move with haste yet. She commanded the space entirely, the air vibrating with the pressure that bent reality around her. Jake stumbled back, tripping over roots and stones. She descended slowly, each movement fluid, a ballet of inevitability. Justice cannot wait. Her whisper floated through the park, each word seeming to resonate in his chest, striking at his heart. Jake screamed, not in fear of death, but in the understanding of what he had created, a world in which his choices had summoned a force beyond comprehension, a power that demanded equilibrium. He tried to flee, but all directions twisted. The paths looped, the trees shifted, shadows conspired. Every corner led back to her. Finally, he fell to his knees, unable to rise, breathless, trembling, consumed by the terror of accountability. Lena's presence solidified, her form closer, tangible yet ethereal. Her gaze bored into him, unyielding, measuring every misdeed, every betrayal, every selfish impulse that had led to her death. "You believed I would vanish, that death would free you," she whispered. "But death is not absence. It is law deferred. Your guilt has summoned me." And then she moved closer, until he could feel a coldness that pierced to his marrow, not of frost, but of judgment. Her hands hovered above him, impossibly still, yet he felt their weight on his soul. He shivered, fully aware that escape was meaningless. The city, the streets, even the night air had been shaped into her instrument of reckoning. Jake's knees buckled. He could not speak, could not think clearly. The only certainty was the inevitability of her presence, the finality of the law she embodied. And then, the whisper again. Justice is not mercy. Justice is not haste. It is the balance restored. A pulse of energy, subtle yet overwhelming, swept through him. It was not pain but comprehension. He was bound by her will, by the ritual that had delayed death, by the very essence of her endurance. Exhausted, broken, Jake collapsed fully. The mist swirled around him, the world stabilizing as though paused. Lena hovered above, her expression softening just enough to show that her purpose had been served. Miller's earlier warning echoed in his memory. The spirit acted with law-like precision, guided by ritual, intent, and justice. Jake had no allies, no options, only the reckoning laid bare. The final moments were silent but absolute. Lena faded, leaving the lingering fragrance, the binding energy, the unavoidable understanding that death and justice could be intertwined, delayed, yet inevitable. Jake remained kneeling, shivering in the chill, utterly alone with the truth of his actions and the inevitability of their consequences. He would live, but he would never escape the knowledge that she had controlled the space, the time, and the justice delivered. When Miller arrived later, guided by Lena's mother, he found the apartment, or what remained of it, eerily intact. No signs of struggle, no visible cause of death. Only Jake, pale, trembling, and fully aware that he had encountered forces beyond comprehension. The ritual had worked as intended. The spirit acted. Justice was measured, and the guilty were confronted not always with blood, but with an understanding far more profound, far more haunting than any mortal punishment. Miller noted in his report, no one was physically harmed in the final confrontation, yet the outcome was absolute. Lena's justice, delayed but deliberate, was enacted according to the ancient ritual. Her spirit, restrained by custom and law beyond our world, moved with purpose. Jake's life continues, but the weight of her presence and the inevitability of consequence will follow him always. The mountains, the wind, the fragrance, all bore witness to the completion of the binding. Lena's purpose had been fulfilled, the balance restored, and Miller left with a silent acknowledgement. The living and the dead share rules deeper than human comprehension, and sometimes justice must move slowly, deliberately, beyond our perception, yet always inevitably. The mountains had always been silent witnesses to generations of secrets, but tonight they seemed to lean in closer, listening. Miller had driven through winding roads, shrouded in fog, guided by Lena's mother, who spoke little, yet exuded an unshakable certainty. The night air smelled of pine and damp earth, but beneath it lingered something older, an energy that made the hairs on his neck prickle. Each step closer to the peak was heavier, as though gravity itself sought to slow him down. The lodge where Lena had lived with her mother now loomed ahead, a structure of aged timber and stone, appearing almost carved from the mountain itself. Moonlight struck the roof at a sharp angle, revealing cracks and shadows that seemed to move. Miller's boots crunched on the gravel path, echoing like a warning. He paused at the threshold, taking in the faint flicker of candlelight through the windows. Sensing that this was more than a home, it was a nexus, a conduit of the ritual's lingering force. Inside, Lena's mother sat at a low table, various objects laid out, small bowls of salt, feathers, black candles, and an ancient tome with pages frayed and yellowed by centuries. Her hands moved with a practiced precision, fingers tracing symbols that Miller did not recognize. Each gesture seemed to hum in the air, as though reality itself was vibrating to her will. Lena's mother looked up, eyes calm yet piercing. "He must understand," she said softly. "The ritual is not just about punishment. It is about balance. He must confront what he has done, and we guide the culmination." Miller followed silently, watching as she arranged the items in a precise formation, reciting words in a language unfamiliar but resonant. The air thickened, a tangible weight pressing down, and Miller felt his chest tighten. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, curling around the room. It was Lena, her voice calm yet haunting, speaking not words of malice but of inevitability. "The peak is where all debts are measured." Outside, the wind rose sharply, rattling the windows and making the candles flicker violently. Miller's focus tightened. He could feel the ritual's energy building, a crescendo of intent, guiding Lena's spirit to the apex of her purpose. He glanced at the tome, noticing diagrams of constellations and mountain peaks, intersecting lines that seemed to map the energy flow. It was clear the ritual required Jake to confront the mountain itself, to ascend, to acknowledge the full weight of his actions. Miller and Lena's mother moved quickly. Preparations were complete, and a signal came. A soft bell, its tone precise, ringing 3 times. Immediately, The temperature in the room dropped, and the scent of Lena's perfume grew stronger, almost overwhelming. A faint glow appeared at the center of the room, coalescing into Lena's form. She was ethereal, yet vivid, her eyes holding the same intensity as in the chase. She did not speak, only gestured toward the mountain path outside, toward the peak shrouded in mist. Jake, waiting at the base, was trembling. His body still carried the strain of the chase and confrontation, but his mind now understood that there was no escape. The mountain called him, demanded his compliance. Miller accompanied him, steadying him where his legs wobbled, and Lena's mother followed, murmuring incantations that seemed to push against reality itself. The path upward was steep, roots and rocks making every step a test of willpower. As they ascended, the fog thickened, forming shapes that flickered in the corners of vision, faces, hands, shadows of past transgressions. Jake staggered, feeling every memory of betrayal, of violence, of selfishness weigh down his steps. Lena's presence hovered above, guiding but never touching, a force of judgment and balance. Miller noticed the subtle tremors of energy, as if the mountain itself was alive, responding to the ritual, feeding off the emotional intensity of guilt and remorse. Halfway to the peak, a sudden gust threw Jake off balance. He fell to his knees, gasping, overwhelmed by the force of Lena's judgment. Her voice whispered in the wind, carrying both accusation and instruction. Acknowledge, repent, accept the weight you bear. He felt tears streaming, not from fear but from the crushing clarity of what he had wrought. Every lie, every act of betrayal, every moment of selfishness came rushing to his consciousness in vivid clarity. Miller's presence was grounding. "You have to reach the summit," he urged, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "It's the only way." Jake nodded, swallowing bile and fear, forcing himself upward. Each step was agony, but with every step, the pressure of Lena's gaze felt less accusatory and more like a scale balancing itself. At the summit, the fog parted slightly, revealing a stone altar, worn with age but commanding in presence. Symbols etched into its surface seemed to hum, resonating with a deep vibrating energy. Lena floated before it, her form glowing softly. Jake stepped forward, trembling, and laid his hands upon the cold stone. The moment he did, a shiver ran through him, an electric shock of awareness that connected him to every consequence of his actions. Lena's mother chanted, her voice rising, guiding the energy around them. The air thickened, shimmering with a faint, iridescent glow. Jake felt himself lifted, metaphorically, by the weight of judgment. Every act of wrongdoing measured, every word of malice counted. He fell to his knees, not out of fear but in submission, understanding that his endurance was now tied to the ritual's resolution. Then, a profound silence fell. The wind stilled, the fog cleared, and the altar's symbols glowed faintly before dimming. Lena hovered, expression softened, eyes conveying a rare mercy born from justice fulfilled. Jake felt the weight lift slightly, the oppressive guilt still present, but balanced by the ritual's intent. He was free in one sense, free from the uncontrolled wrath of a spirit, but forever bound to the memory of this confrontation. Miller stepped forward, guiding Jake down carefully, noting every subtle shift in Lena's energy. She remained at the peak a moment longer, then slowly dissipated, her form breaking into motes of light that scattered with the wind. The mountains, once silent, seemed to exhale, the ambient energy settling into a calm equilibrium. At the base, Lena's mother regarded Jake with solemn eyes. "The peak teaches balance," she said. "Life and death, love and betrayal, justice and mercy, they intertwine. You have witnessed the ritual's fullness. Carry its lesson." Jake nodded, exhausted, shivering, and silently vowing never to forget. Miller recorded his observations meticulously. Every anomaly, every psychological response, every energy pattern was noted, not as proof for the outside world, but as a testament to what he had witnessed. The ritual had completed its arc. Accusation, pursuit, confrontation, judgment, and resolution. The binding, once a curse, had transformed, into a measured justice that allowed the spirit to return to rest. As dawn broke, the first light caught the mist, illuminating the mountain and the lodge. The forest returned to quietude. Jake, Miller, and Lena's mother descended slowly, each step lighter yet burdened by the weight of understanding. No words were necessary. The mountain, the ritual, and the spirit had spoken. By the time they returned to the town below, it was nearly morning. Jake's eyes, though weary, reflected clarity. Miller filed his final report, noting that the ritual's culmination had been extraordinary in both execution and outcome. The lesson was simple yet profound. The living and the dead operate under rules often beyond comprehension, and when the laws of life and spirit intersect, the consequences are absolute, deliberate, and unavoidable. The binding ritual, centuries old, had reached its peak. Justice, long deferred, was enacted with precision, and Lena, finally, rested not in absence, but in equilibrium. The descent from the mountain was quieter than the ascent. Dawn had painted the forest in muted golds and grays, and the air carried the clean scent of morning dew. Jake walked with slow, deliberate steps, each footfall crunching against the frost-tinged underbrush, but he no longer felt the frantic terror that had driven him the night before. Instead, a heavy, contemplative weight had settled upon his shoulders, a burden of truth he could no longer avoid. Miller stayed close, observing every subtle twitch, every silent reflection, understanding that the ritual's completion did not mark the end of its effects. It merely transitioned the energy from confrontation to acknowledgement. Lena's mother, silent and composed, led the way, her presence like an anchor to a storm-tossed vessel, calm and unyielding. At the base, near the small clearing where Miller's vehicle waited, Jake paused. His breath came in slow, shaky clouds, the physical exertion finally catching up with him. He could feel the imprint of the ritual still on his body, a tingling in his fingertips and along his spine, a residue of power that reminded him of the mountain's judgment. "I need to speak," Jake said, voice hoarse but firm. He turned to Miller, eyes wide with a clarity that had been absent for months, maybe years. I need to confess everything to anyone who will listen." Miller nodded. "Then do it," he said, his tone steady. "The ritual does not erase responsibility. It only illuminates it. Your acknowledgement is the next step." Lena's mother remained still, hands folded. She did not speak, but allowed him the space to confront himself. In that silence, the forest seemed to lean closer, listening. Even the birds, hidden among branches, seemed to pause their songs. Jake inhaled, closing his eyes for a moment, gathering the fragments of courage and shame into a single thread he could speak aloud. "I loved her," he began, voice shaking. "I loved Lena, but in that love, I became blinded by jealousy, by fear, by anger. I thought controlling her, keeping her close, would protect that love. I was wrong. I was monstrous. I killed her. And for 2 weeks, I lived with the knowledge and hid it, hoping it would fade, hoping it could be undone. But it could not. And now I see everything I tried to deny has been laid bare. I am responsible. I am guilty." The words hung in the crisp morning air, reverberating against the slope of the mountain as if nature itself acknowledged the confession. Miller listened quietly, taking note, understanding that this admission, this full confrontation of guilt, was an extension of the ritual. It was no longer just spiritual, it was psychological, binding Jake not to fear alone, but to truth. "I need to go to the authorities," Jake continued. "I need to ensure the law sees this. I cannot run. I cannot hide. The ritual has shown me the consequences of evasion." Miller placed a hand lightly on Jake's shoulder. "You must. But remember, what you carry now is the memory of accountability, not just punishment. Lena's spirit, she is at peace. That was the final intention. Your confession completes it for both the living and the dead." And Lena's mother finally spoke, her voice calm but resolute, carrying the weight of generations of knowledge. The binding ritual does not destroy, nor does it forgive. It allows the natural order to assert itself. The living confront their deeds. The dead are granted their due. Jake, you have reached the resolution. Now, you must live within it. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. His throat ached from the exertion of speaking truths he had buried for so long. He felt the icy remnants of the mountain's energy fade, replaced by a heavy warmth, a human understanding of consequences, morality, and the cost of actions. Together, the three made their way to the road where Miller's car was parked. The first hints of sunlight broke through the trees, casting long shadows over the ground. Miller drove, keeping glances on Jake, who stared out the window at the awakening forest. His mind replayed the ritual in fragments: the chase, Lena's apparition, the peak, the altar, and finally, the quiet peace that followed. By mid-morning, they reached the small town where the authorities waited. Jake stepped out, hands trembling slightly, heart hammering, but he did not flinch. The officers, briefed by Miller, listened as he recounted everything. The relationship, the arguments, the jealousy, the fatal confrontation, and the subsequent events. His narrative was precise, methodical, but there was no attempt to diminish responsibility. Every pause, every intonation reflected the gravity of his actions and the understanding instilled by the ritual. "I have nothing to hide," Jake concluded. "I only seek to face the consequences. I will answer for what I have done." The officers exchanged glances, noting the sincerity and the visible burden Jake carried. They began the formal processes, taking statements, collecting evidence, and guiding him through the legal obligations. Throughout, Miller remained present, documenting and observing, ensuring that the spiritual and psychological dimensions of the case were understood. Meanwhile, Lena's mother retreated to a nearby bench, watching the town stir to life around her. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the morning air, sensing that the ritual's energy had dissipated, leaving only balance in its wake. The mountains behind her, though distant, seemed to hum softly, a low resonance of completion. Hours passed. The confession completed, Jake was taken into custody. Miller recorded his final observations, noting that the human component, the confession, the acknowledgement of guilt, and the willingness to accept consequences was as crucial to the binding ritual as any spiritual or supernatural element. The alignment between justice, personal accountability, and spiritual closure had manifested fully. As the sun climbed higher, a subtle breeze carried through the streets, whispering faintly through the trees and alleys. It felt as if Lena's presence lingered, not in anger, not in accusation, but in the quiet observation of justice served. The perfume, once a haunting signature of the delayed death, had vanished, leaving only the natural scent of the morning. Miller walked through the streets, reflecting on what he had witnessed. The binding ritual had functioned on multiple levels: the spirit's unfinished business, the perpetrator's confrontation, the psychological reckoning, and the final acknowledgement of truth. It was a rare convergence, a scenario where supernatural influence and human law met, each amplifying the other to restore balance. Days later, the town settled back into its routine, though whispers lingered, tales of a girl with pale skin and an enduring spirit, of a mountain that demanded justice, and of a ritual that could delay death to enforce moral reckoning. Jake remained in custody, his case proceeding through the judicial system. Every detail, every confession, every testimony carried the weight of both earthly law and a spectral decree. Miller filed his final report not only as an investigator, but as a chronicler of a rare phenomenon. He described the events in detail, noting the psychological effects on the living, the observable presence of Lena's spirit, and the final resolution that allowed her to move on. He emphasized the necessity of acknowledging guilt, of facing consequences, and the extraordinary intersection of human justice with spiritual mediation. In the quiet of his office, Miller looked at the mountains in the distance. The early morning sun reflected off their peaks, casting long shadows over the valleys below. He felt the lingering resonance of the ritual, a balance achieved, a justice delivered, and a spirit freed. The binding ritual had concluded, leaving behind lessons etched not only into the minds of those involved, but also into the subtle currents of the natural world, where the living and the dead, the guilty and the innocent, intersect in fragile equilibrium. And in that stillness, one could almost sense Lena's final whisper carried on the wind. Justice does not forgive, but it does endure. End of take. The threshold shift. Sarah had imagined a perfect start to her new life with Mark, her husband of just a few weeks. The apartment they had moved into gleamed with modernity, polished floors that reflected the morning light, a kitchen lined with stainless steel appliances, and tall windows that overlooked a quiet cityscape. On paper, it was everything a newlywed could desire. Yet the first night brought an unease she had not anticipated. It began subtly. She awoke with a start to find herself lying not on the bed, but on the floor at the threshold of the bedroom door. At first, she thought it a trick of memory, a dream misplaced in reality. But the tiles were cold against her skin, the faint draft brushing against her face, and the bed remained empty, untouched. Confused, she turned her head to see the familiar outline of the doorframe and the shadow of the hallway stretching beyond. She could not remember how she had arrived there, nor why her body had obeyed some instinct stronger than her consciousness. The following nights were no better. Sarah began to wake up repeatedly at the doorway, sometimes with her limbs inexplicably constrained, as if caught in invisible ropes. The air in the room seemed thicker, heavier, charged with a subtle, almost tangible pressure. Shadows at the corners of her vision would stretch unnaturally, or sometimes fragment into shapes resembling faces, silent and observing. She tried to tell Mark, but his work consumed him. Late nights, exhausted returns, eyes red from hours spent behind computer screens. He would dismiss her fears with a hand on her shoulder and a tired, "It's nothing, Sarah. You're just stressed." Yet she knew it was more than stress. There was an intelligence in the disturbances, a deliberate, patient probing at the edges of her perception. The threshold of the bedroom, the simple line between wall and doorframe, had become a point of contention. Something unseen was aware of her presence, gauging her reactions, testing boundaries she did not understand. By the fourth night, Sarah could no longer bear the isolation of her terror. She called Ethan, a private investigator who specialized in phenomena beyond the purely physical. Ethan was meticulous, rational, and known for resolving cases that defied conventional explanation. He arrived with a calm demeanor, eyes that scanned both the room and its shadows with clinical precision. He immediately noted the odd stillness of the apartment. Despite the city lights beyond the windows, the building felt hollow, as if the air itself had weight. The elevator's hum lingered longer than expected, a sustained note that seemed to echo in the hallways, and the faint draft that crept along the baseboards was colder than it should have been for early spring. Sarah, her voice trembling, recounted her experiences. "I wake up at the doorway. I don't know why, and sometimes I see things, shadows, maybe faces. I feel them watching me, always waiting." Ethan listened attentively, taking notes without interruption. "Threshold disturbances are not uncommon," he said carefully. "They manifest when spatial arrangements interfere with energetic currents. The living and not living share the same liminal space at points of transition, doorways, corridors, windows. When those currents are obstructed, it can provoke reactionary behavior from entities attuned to the thresholds." And Sarah followed him as he moved through the apartment, noting everything: the distance from bed to door, the angles of tables, the placement of rugs. Ethan paused at the bedroom doorway, a faint chill brushing against his sleeve. "Here," he said, pointing. "This is your nexus. Your body is reacting subconsciously to the obstruction of this threshold. Your dreams, your awakenings, are your mind's attempt to reconcile the flow of unseen currents with your physical environment." He adjusted the bed slightly, moving it away from the direct line of the doorway, and repositioned small objects that could have been blocking the path of energy. Instantly, Sarah felt a subtle difference in the air, less oppressive, but still heavy with expectation. There was no longer the sharp panic she had felt upon waking at the doorway, but a lingering awareness that something, someone, was still present, watching, patient, and cautious. Mark arrived home later, his briefcase in hand, exhaustion written across his face. Sarah explained the events of the past nights, demonstrating her prior positions and recounting her dreams. Mark's initial reaction was disbelief tempered with concern. "You've been through a lot," he said softly. "Maybe we just need to get used to the new place." Ethan was precise. "It is not mere habit or imagination," he explained. "You are experiencing the interaction of the physical environment with a non-corporeal presence. The threshold cannot be ignored. To ignore it is to provoke testing. To obstruct it is to incite escalation. Respect is required." That night, Sarah lay in the adjusted bedroom. Sleep came with a tentative ease, though her dreams were vivid and unsettling. She dreamt of long corridors lined with doors she had never seen, doors that seemed to breathe and pulse with expectation. Shadows moved independently of light sources, faces flickering in and out of perception. The most persistent presence was near the doorway, calm but insistent, watching her with a patient gaze that made her stomach tighten. Mark slept beside her, unaware of the intensity of her experience. His breathing was steady, rhythmic, and a sharp contrast to her heightened alertness. Sarah focused on the instructions Ethan had given her. Observe without obstruction, acknowledge without fear. The shapes at the edges of her vision did not advance. Instead, they lingered, waiting, testing her ability to maintain composure. By dawn, she felt a cautious sense of relief. The air in the room seemed lighter, the shadows less oppressive. Yet, deep down, Sarah knew the apartment was not empty of its hidden residents. The threshold remained a point of negotiation, a boundary that demanded acknowledgement and respect. She realized that the apartment was more than a home. It was a liminal space, a crossing between worlds, and that the entities there were neither hostile nor benign. They were patient and unyielding, indifferent to human habitation, but sensitive to human interference. Her very life, her very sleep, was entwined with the subtle currents of the threshold, and she could not ignore it any longer. Ethan returned the following day, armed with precise instruments and a keen eye for detail. He measured subtle changes in air pressure, electromagnetic fluctuations, and temperature variances. The apartment appeared normal, yet the bedroom doorway revealed faint ripples of fluctuating energy, almost imperceptible, pulsating in rhythm with Sarah's subconscious. "This is the ghost threshold," he said. "It is a point of convergence between the physical and the spectral. You sense it instinctively because it responds to your presence. Your awakenings at the doorway are a subconscious acknowledgement of its significance." He moved around the apartment, checking corners, windows, and even air vents. The living room offered no anomalies, but near the hallway closet, a faint layering of whispers emerged, indistinct and overlapping, an auditory residue of repeated observation. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he tapped lightly against the wall, producing a subtle hum that interacted with the voices. Sarah could not hear the technique, but she sensed the resonance, a vibration in her chest, a subtle recognition of the presence. Mark's skepticism remained, but he could not deny the growing tension in the air. Ethan emphasized the importance of routine, of balance, and of maintaining awareness without fear. The disturbances, he explained, were neither attacks nor threats. They were observations, tests, and corrections, triggered when human activity obstructed the natural flow. As evening approached, Sarah lay once more in the adjusted bedroom. Sleep came more readily, and the shadowed figures retreated to the peripheries of her awareness. Yet she knew they were still present, patient and watchful. Her respect for the threshold, her acknowledgement of its importance, had mitigated the intensity of their observation, but she understood that this was a temporary reprieve. The entities would return as they always did, to test and to observe. The first part of her journey had concluded, but the true depth of the threshold's influence and the persistence of the unseen was only beginning. Sarah understood now that she was not alone, that the apartment itself was a living entity of sorts, and that the boundaries she had crossed were as real as the walls and doors that enclosed her. She drifted into a restless sleep, readying herself for the next encounter with the threshold that defined her nights and challenged her understanding of the unseen. Ethan returned to the apartment the following morning with a sense of purpose. He moved quietly, deliberately, carrying a set of instruments, notebooks, and a camera. Sarah greeted him at the door, her face pale but determined. She had spent the night awake, listening to the subtle creaks of the building and the faint shifting of air around the bedroom threshold. Sleep had been fitful, punctuated by images of shadows lingering at the doorway, observing her, waiting for her to falter. "Have you noticed anything new?" Ethan asked as he stepped inside. His tone was calm, yet Sarah sensed an intensity beneath it, a focused attention that made the air feel taut. "Only that it feels stronger tonight," she replied. "The pressure, the awareness. I felt them watching me even as I tried to fall asleep." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the room. He crouched near the doorway, studying the space carefully, observing the angles of the bed, the positioning of the nightstand, the flow of light from the window. "The threshold reacts to more than just your presence," he said. "It responds to energy, intent, and the subtle dissonances in the environment. Every object, every shadow contributes to the currents. We need to map these interactions." For the next several hours, Ethan moved through the apartment with meticulous precision. He adjusted furniture slightly, aligned the bed with the longest stretch of unobstructed floor, and moved decorative objects that could interfere with the natural flow of energy. Every so often, he paused to measure fluctuations with his devices: a thermometer, an EMF detector, and a camera capable of capturing subtle visual anomalies. Sarah watched him, both fascinated and terrified. "How do you know it's real? That it's not just my imagination?" she asked. "Your imagination is part of it," Ethan replied. "The human mind perceives these thresholds because our consciousness interacts with the energies present. But the consistency of your experiences, the physiological responses, and the subtle disturbances I'm detecting indicate something external is influencing your perception. This is not hallucination." And he spent particular attention on the bedroom doorway, the locus of the disturbances. He knelt beside it, tracing the frame with his hand, sensing the temperature gradient that shifted in ways Sarah could barely detect. There was a subtle pressure, like an invisible hand pressing against the boundary, fluctuating with an intelligence that was neither human nor chaotic. Ethan's measurements revealed anomalies. A slight cold spot lingered along the frame, fluctuating unpredictably. EMF readings spiked intermittently, unconnected to any electrical source in the apartment. Sarah could feel the presence of the threshold more acutely as Ethan's attention intensified, as if the entity recognized the scrutiny and adjusted its behavior in response. "Stay calm," Ethan instructed. "Focus on your breathing. Observe without reacting. The moment you show fear, the threshold's influence grows. This is a negotiation, not a confrontation." Sarah nodded, though her chest tightened. She had learned to distinguish between ordinary fear and the oppressive awareness she felt at the threshold. The shadows, the pressure, the almost imperceptible murmur of countless voices, lingering just beyond perception. All of it demanded recognition, but not panic. Ethan began a series of experiments. He guided Sarah to lie on the bed while he rearranged objects methodically, noting changes in her subconscious responses. A chair moved slightly to the side, a lamp tilted by a few degrees, a vase shifted closer to the corner of the room. Each adjustment elicited a subtle reaction: a flinch, a change in breathing, a slight trembling. "These reactions are important," Ethan explained. "They indicate the threshold is actively monitoring, assessing your compliance with the natural flow. Every adjustment you allow without resistance reinforces the balance. Every subconscious refusal, every tension is recorded and acknowledged." By mid-afternoon, Ethan had completed his initial survey. He asked Sarah to stand at the doorway, facing the hallway. She felt the familiar pressure at her back and the faint hum of unseen energy in front of her. Ethan watched closely, taking notes on her posture, her muscle tension, her subtle shifts in gaze. "You are unconsciously responding to the threshold," he observed. "Your body aligns with the energy currents automatically. It is learning from your actions, testing your reactions, calibrating its influence. Sarah shivered. So it's alive? She asked, the word tasting strange on her tongue. In a sense, Ethan replied carefully. Not alive in the way we are, but it has persistence, awareness, and memory. It does not forget interactions. It does not forgive obstructions, and it does not act without purpose. This threshold exists to maintain balance, to regulate passage between the physical and non-physical. You have intruded upon it, and now it demands acknowledgement. He instructed Sarah to lie down again, eyes open, and to observe the subtle changes in the room. Shadows flickered with the shifting light, elongating unnaturally along the walls. The threshold at the doorway seemed to pulse faintly, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the subtle fluctuations Ethan had recorded earlier. Sarah could feel a pull at the edges of her consciousness, like a gentle tug urging her to rise, to step into the hallway. Do not resist, but do not act hastily, Ethan cautioned. The threshold's purpose is not to harm. It seeks recognition, order, and respect. Every motion you take in alignment strengthens the balance. Every fear-based reaction invites imbalance, and imbalance attracts escalation. Hours passed. Sarah's understanding of the threshold deepened as she learned to read its cues. It was patient, calculating, yet consistent. The apartment itself seemed to participate. The floors creaking in subtle patterns, the walls exhaling faint drafts, the air thickening and thinning as if breathing in sync with the unseen presence. Ethan continued his monitoring into the evening. He traced energy lines along the floor with chalk, marking intersections and nodes. He noted the angles of light and shadow, the impact of even minor movements on the currents. Sarah observed, increasingly aware of the delicate interplay between her environment and the unseen intelligence. Every home has its energies, Ethan said. Most are dormant, inconsequential. But some, like this one, intersect with forces that are aware, capable of interaction, and persistent. The threshold at your bedroom door is a convergence point, a liminal interface. It is responding to your presence, to the arrangement of your environment, to the patterns of your life. No, Sarah asked. Will it ever stop? Not unless respect is maintained, Ethan answered. The threshold does not leave. It waits. It observes. It tests. Your role is to acknowledge it, to understand its logic, and to act in accordance with its rules. Defiance, ignorance, or fear, these will provoke escalation. As night fell, the apartment grew quiet, but the intensity of the threshold increased. Shadows lengthened, pulsing subtly along walls and corners. Sarah felt a familiar weight at her back and along her limbs, a pressure that made sleep impossible. She lay on the bed, conscious of every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle twitch in the muscles of her body. Ethan remained at the doorway, vigilant. He noted the subtle shifts in EMF readings and temperature gradients, marking every anomaly. It is communicating, he said quietly, through pressure, through movement, through the alignment of currents. It seeks confirmation that its space is respected. Sarah closed her eyes, attempting to focus, to integrate the experience. She imagined herself as part of the threshold, not an intruder, but a participant in its balance. Slowly, the oppressive weight lessened. Shadows receded slightly, though not entirely, and the pulsing at the doorway softened. The apartment seemed to breathe in response, a subtle rhythm that mirrored her own. By midnight, they paused. Ethan had gathered extensive data, measurements, observations, and patterns that would require days of analysis. He turned to Sarah. You have adapted well. The threshold is still present, still observant, but you have begun to negotiate its parameters. This is the first step toward cohabitation, rather than conflict. Sarah exhaled, relief mingled with lingering fear. Does this mean I'm safe? Ethan shook his head gently. Safe is relative. You have learned to acknowledge and respect. You have not provoked escalation. That is the best outcome for now. But the threshold is patient. It will continue to test, continue to observe. Your vigilance must remain constant. Complacency is dangerous. As Ethan packed his instruments and prepared to leave, Sarah felt a cautious sense of empowerment. She understood the threshold in a way she had never understood before, recognizing the delicate balance between her consciousness and the unseen, between her actions and the apartment's responses. Yet, even as she drifted toward a tentative sleep, a shadow flickered at the edge of the room, lingering just beyond perception. She sensed it, acknowledged it, and allowed it to exist without fear. The threshold had not disappeared, it had only paused, patient, deliberate, awaiting the next interaction, the next test, the next acknowledgement of its presence. The examination was over, but the negotiation had only just begun. Sarah had survived her first full night with awareness intact, but the apartment and the threshold within it would not allow complacency. The unseen, patient, and persistent had claimed its place in her life. And she understood, with a shiver of realization, that this was not a battle she could win. It was a balance she must maintain. The night after Ethan's initial examination, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. Though she understood the nature of the threshold better, her awareness made the apartment feel alive in an unnerving way. Every creak, every sigh of the building seemed amplified, as if the house itself were testing her resolve. She could almost sense the subtle movement of energy along the walls, the faint shifts of air that marked the boundary between the physical and the supernatural. By 11 o'clock, Ethan returned, carrying more instruments and a determined expression. He had analyzed the data from their previous session and discovered inconsistencies that suggested the threshold's activity was increasing, not stabilizing. The readings indicate a stronger presence tonight, he explained. The threshold is aware of our previous interactions. It recognizes that we have been observing and modifying its environment. It perceives our intentions. Sarah nodded, her stomach tightening. It knows us. Ethan's gaze was steady. It does, and it will act accordingly. The next step is to confront its behavior directly. Subtle observation and passive acknowledgement are no longer sufficient. We must engage. They began in the bedroom, focusing on the doorway that had become the focal point of the disturbances. Ethan moved the bed slightly again, aligning it with the longest stretch of unobstructed floor. He arranged furniture to facilitate the natural flow of energy, marking nodes with chalk where the threshold seemed most sensitive. Remember, he said, our actions must be deliberate, measured. The threshold does not forgive impulsivity. Missteps provoke it. Observe, react consciously, but do not act in fear. Sarah lay on the bed as Ethan adjusted the remaining objects in the room. She felt a subtle pull at the edges of her consciousness, the familiar pressure against her back and along her limbs. Unlike before, the sensation was sharper, more insistent, as if the threshold were impatient. Suddenly, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air thickened. Shadows elongated unnaturally along the walls, converging at the doorway. Sarah felt a compulsion to rise, to step into the hallway, but she resisted. Her breath came shallow, rapid, as if she were swimming against a current she could neither see nor touch. Ethan observed silently, noting every physiological reaction, the tightening of her jaw, the subtle trembling of her hands, the micro-adjustments of her posture. It's testing your limits, he said. The threshold escalates to gauge compliance. Your reactions are the measure of your readiness to negotiate. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to fill the room. Sarah's ears detected it before her eyes did, and the sensation was accompanied by a subtle vibration in the floorboards. The shadows at the doorway pulsed in time with the hum, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that seemed to correspond with her heartbeat. Sarah's eyes widened. She realized that the threshold was not merely a passive observer. It was responsive, intelligent, aware of her state, feeding on her fear and her focus. I can feel it. Inside me, she whispered. Ethan nodded, calm but intense. Good. Awareness is critical. You must observe the intrusion without losing control, The moment you panic, you give it leverage. He handed her a small, smooth stone, etched with runes that he had traced onto the chalk markings. Focus on this. Let it anchor your perception. It's a bridge between your intent and the threshold's influence. Treat it as your stabilizing point. And Sarah grasped the stone, feeling a strange warmth radiate from it. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if aware of the anchor she held. The hum intensified, but now it carried a subtle resonance that Sarah could manipulate through her focus, regulating her breathing and mental attention to match its rhythm. Hours passed in a tense, delicate balance. Sarah lay on the bed, eyes open, muscles taut yet controlled, while Ethan observed the room with instruments and notes, tracking fluctuations in temperature, electromagnetic activity, and subtle visual distortions. The threshold's activity intensified in waves, periods of near silence punctuated by sudden gusts of cold air, rapid shadow shifts, and faint, fleeting voices that seemed to whisper from beyond the doorway. At one point, a fleeting vision appeared. A figure, indistinct but humanoid, standing at the threshold, gazing at her with a presence that felt both curious and menacing. Sarah's breath caught, but she held the stone tightly and did not move. The figure seemed to regard her silently for a long moment, then dissolved into the ambient shadows, leaving a lingering impression of cold awareness. "It wants to provoke," Ethan said softly. "It will escalate until it finds our parameters. Tonight is a negotiation of endurance." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I understand. I think I do." The night deepened, and the apartment's energy became increasingly restless. Objects shifted subtly, though without physical cause. Light reflections warped across the walls, elongating shapes and creating false perspectives. Sarah felt as if the walls themselves were breathing, inhaling and exhaling in tune with her own body. Ethan suggested a further exercise. He instructed Sarah to stand at the doorway and extend her awareness outward. "Project your presence. Engage the threshold with intent, not fear. Let it recognize that you occupy this space consciously, without resistance." Sarah hesitated, then stepped into the threshold zone. Immediately, a weight pressed against her chest, as though the air itself were thickened by the presence. She felt a coldness creeping along her spine and a subtle tug at the crown of her head. Yet, she forced herself to remain upright, focusing on the rhythm of the stone in her palm. The shadows responded, moving more rapidly, coalescing and dispersing in patterns she could not predict. Whispered tones, incomprehensible, yet laden with expectation, brushed her ears. Each breath was a conscious effort, each heartbeat a test of endurance. Hours bled into each other. The threshold's escalation became rhythmic, almost ritualistic. Cold waves surged across the floor, pulsing in intervals that matched the faint hum. Shadows elongated into strange, jagged forms, sometimes resembling distorted human shapes, sometimes simply abstract. Sarah noticed faint reflections in the window glass, forms moving contrary to natural laws, shapes that could not exist outside of her perception. Ethan observed, taking careful notes. "You are now engaging with the threshold on its own terms. It recognizes your persistence. But this is the limit testing phase. The presence will attempt to destabilize your focus. Every lapse will be noted." Sarah felt exhaustion mounting. Her limbs grew heavy, her mind foggy. The room itself seemed to resist her attention, subtle distortions tugging at her awareness. But each time she wavered, she gripped the stone tighter, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second to reset her focus, and continued to engage the threshold consciously. A new phenomenon appeared. The air vibrated, carrying echoes of past interactions. Faint images from previous nights manifested in fleeting visions, glimpses of herself at the threshold, shadows reacting to her movements, subtle shifts she had not consciously noted before. The threshold was showing her the past as a test of memory, perception, and control. "Remember every movement," Ethan said quietly. "Every shift, every adjustment. It wants to see consistency. Inconsistency invites escalation. You must prove that you can exist here without provoking chaos. Sarah complied, her focus sharpening despite the creeping fatigue. She moved slowly, deliberately, adjusting her position by inches, monitoring subtle changes in shadows and temperature. Each small success was reinforced by a slight easing of pressure, a reduction in the intensity of the whispers, a flicker of harmony in the ambient energy. Suddenly, the apartment's energy surged. Shadows erupted into sharp, erratic shapes that seemed to lunge toward her. A low, resonant tone filled the room, pressing against her chest and skull. Her heart raced, but she remained upright, anchored by the stone. The threshold's escalation had reached its peak. Ethan stepped forward. "Now," he said, "respond with intent. Let it know your presence is deliberate, measured, and unafraid." Sarah exhaled and focused her mind. She visualized a protective boundary around herself, a sphere of conscious intent that pushed outward, touching the threshold and negotiating its energy. Gradually, the chaotic shadows began to recoil, the air thinned, and the oppressive weight lifted fractionally. The hum subsided, leaving a subtle resonance, as if the threshold were acknowledging her control. By dawn, the room was quiet. The apartment itself seemed to relax, the shadows returning to normal length. The air no longer thickened. Sarah collapsed onto the bed, drained but aware. The stone had warmed in her hand, a tangible reminder of the bridge she had created between herself and the threshold. Ethan recorded his final observations. "The escalation has been mitigated. You have demonstrated the ability to exist within the threshold's influence without provoking destabilization. But this is temporary. The presence will continue to test. It will escalate again. You must remain vigilant." Sarah nodded, still trembling from the intensity of the night. "I understand. I'll be ready." As Ethan left, Sarah looked around the apartment, sensing the residual energy of the threshold. It was patient, deliberate, and aware, waiting for the next night, the next test, the next opportunity to measure her resolve. The escalation had ended, but the negotiation was ongoing. She had survived, but she knew the threshold was far from finished. The apartment remained quiet, but Sarah could feel the latent currents in every corner. She understood now. Survival was not about avoidance. It was about engagement, awareness, and respect. Every night, every action, every breath within the apartment would be part of an unspoken dialogue with the unseen presence, and she was ready to continue. The night arrived heavy and silent, a prelude that seemed thicker than any ordinary darkness. Sarah had spent the day in a state of heightened awareness, replaying the previous night's escalation over and over in her mind. Every detail, every flicker of shadow, every whisper, every imperceptible draft was etched into her memory. She had rehearsed her response, her stance, her breathing, but no amount of preparation could fully quiet the growing anxiety that coiled in her stomach. Ethan arrived shortly after midnight, carrying his equipment, the weight of its significance mirrored in the furrowed lines of his face. He did not speak much, only nodding at Sarah as he laid down the various instruments and talismans he had prepared for tonight. The air in the apartment already felt different, charged, as though the threshold itself was aware of their intent. "We are entering the critical phase," Ethan said quietly, his voice low, deliberate. "Tonight is not about testing endurance. Tonight is about engagement. The threshold will respond to our intentions, our fear, our presence. It knows you have experienced it, Sarah. It knows you are aware. There is no hiding." Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the stone Ethan had given her. She felt its warmth seeping into her palm, a small but tangible anchor against the surging energy in the room. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice quavered slightly. Ethan nodded. "Good. Focus on the doorway. Allow yourself to be aware of the space it occupies, without letting it dominate your perception. We are not intruding. We are negotiating." They began with the familiar ritual, moving the furniture to align the room with the subtle geomantic points Ethan had previously identified. Chalk markers traced sensitive nodes along the floor. The air felt thicker as Sarah settled herself near the threshold. Shadows pooled unnaturally along the walls, stretching toward her like curious fingers. From the first moments, it was clear the threshold was aware of them. The low hum that had once accompanied minor fluctuations surged, vibrating through the floor up her spine into her skull. The shadows rippled, not in erratic bursts this time, but in deliberate, wave-like motions, converging on the doorway, reacting to her smallest movements. Ethan's instructions came in a measured rhythm. Breathe slowly. Acknowledge it, but do not engage with fear. Establish presence through awareness, not resistance. You are the conscious agent here. Sarah inhaled and exhaled, trying to match her heartbeat to the ambient hum. She could feel it now, the threshold's attention, pressing against her consciousness. Unlike previous nights, it did not attempt subtle provocations first. It came forward with force, tugging at the edges of her perception, whispering fragments of memory, fear, and disorientation. She saw him, or it emerged from the shadows. A figure, humanoid but grotesquely elongated, moved without making sound, its form coalescing and dispersing in impossible angles. Its presence was oppressive, a psychic weight that pushed against her sense of self. Every instinct screamed to run, yet she stood rooted, anchored by the stone in her hand and the knowledge of Ethan's guidance. The figure's eyes, or what could be perceived as eyes, gleamed faintly, red like distant embers, and locked onto her. A sense of recognition passed through her, not understanding, but awareness. The threshold, she realized, was not just reacting, it was intelligent. It was conscious, measuring her, probing her limitations. Step forward. Ethan's voice cut through the oppressive atmosphere. Do not retreat. Engage it with presence, not fear. Show it you occupy this space with purpose. Sarah's legs trembled, but she took a cautious step. Immediately the figure surged forward, the air thickening, shadows lashing outward like dark ribbons. Her vision blurred, sound distorted, but she maintained focus on the stone. The warmth radiated through her, guiding her awareness, reminding her that she was an anchor within this threshold. A voice, or perhaps many layered voices, whispered from every corner. They spoke in unrecognizable tones, shifting from one pitch to another, echoing from impossible directions. Sarah could not discern words, but she understood the meaning. Challenge, testing, dominance. The threshold was attempting to unsettle her, to fracture her focus. She met it with mental clarity. She projected awareness, the conscious intent Ethan had taught her, envisioning herself as a stable point in the room, a presence that could coexist with the threshold without yielding to its chaos. The shadows quivered, pausing as though evaluating the legitimacy of her control. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every movement, every breath, every pulse of her heart was a negotiation. The threshold escalated repeatedly. Gusts of icy air, shadows twisting into monstrous silhouettes, sudden pressure against her chest and limbs. Each wave tested her endurance, her focus, her fear. Yet she did not falter. Ethan monitored silently, adjusting talismans and chalk markers, occasionally whispering guidance. Anchor yourself. Let the stone define the boundary. The figure cannot sustain aggression if you maintain calm awareness. Do not react emotionally. React deliberately. Gradually, the threshold surges became more rhythmic, more structured. It seemed to respond to her intentional calm, the deliberate assertion of her presence. The chaotic distortions softened, though still menacing, and the air, while charged, no longer felt impossibly oppressive. Then came the pivotal moment. The figure coalesced fully, humanoid but with a faint translucence, standing just beyond the threshold's line. It extended something like a hand or a cluster of shadows toward her. She understood instinctively. This was the final test. Her awareness must not waver. She breathed deeply, centering herself, and projected an unwavering presence. The shadows hesitated. The pressure lifted fractionally. Then, with deliberate slowness, the figure recoiled, retracting into the periphery of the threshold. A faint echo of its presence lingered, a subtle acknowledgement of her endurance and control. Ethan stepped forward, voice calm but firm. It recognizes your stability, The threshold acknowledges your negotiation. You have survived the final escalation, and you have engaged on equal terms. Sarah exhaled, collapsing onto the bed. Exhaustion weighed her limbs down, but relief flooded through her. She realized the apartment was still alive, still aware, but now in a state of tentative equilibrium. The threshold was no longer aggressively testing her. It was observing, respecting the boundaries she had established. For the first time, the oppressive weight of the night lifted entirely. The shadows returned to normal shapes. The air lightened, and the subtle hum faded to a gentle resonance. The apartment, though still imbued with supernatural energy, no longer felt like a hostile entity. In the silence that followed, Sarah felt the full extent of her achievement. She had confronted the threshold directly, maintained focus under extreme psychological and environmental stress, and asserted her presence. The balance between human consciousness and supernatural awareness had been established, fragile but undeniable. Ethan packed away his instruments, nodding at her. The confrontation is concluded, for now. But remember, the threshold is patient. It will continue to observe, to test in subtle ways. Your vigilance must remain. Awareness is your protection, not avoidance. Sarah rose from the bed, feeling a renewed sense of agency. The apartment, though still alive in ways ordinary people could not perceive, was now a space she could navigate with purpose. The threshold's presence was undeniable, but no longer overwhelming. As dawn crept over the city, the first rays of light illuminated the apartment. Shadows still clung to corners, but they were no longer menacing. They were simply shapes, extensions of an energy she now understood. The threshold had shifted, not vanished, but the dynamic had changed. She and Ethan had negotiated coexistence, establishing a dialogue between human will and supernatural influence. Sarah exhaled deeply, feeling the tension finally leave her body. She understood that survival within this apartment was not about fear or resistance. It was about engagement, perception, and deliberate action. The threshold, once a source of terror, had become a measure of her own awareness, a constant reminder of the fine line between vulnerability and control. And though she knew future nights might still bring challenges, she felt ready. The confrontation had ended, the escalation resolved, and she had faced the threshold fully. For now, equilibrium had been achieved, and the unseen presence had acknowledged her strength. Morning arrived sluggishly, as though the city itself had been hesitant to break the spell of the night. The soft glow of daylight filtered through the blinds, casting long lines across the apartment floor. Sarah moved carefully, as if every step might disturb a balance she had only just established. The threshold's presence was no longer aggressive, but it was far from absent. Shadows pooled in corners with deliberate, calm, silent observers rather than predators. Ethan had already begun packing away his remaining instruments, the rhythmic motion grounding the apartment in the mundane world once more. "We've done what we can for now," he said, his voice measured but carrying the weight of responsibility. "The threshold acknowledges your presence, your awareness. That does not mean it has forgotten or retreated entirely." Sarah nodded, feeling both relief and residual tension. The night had left a mark deeper than fatigue. It had altered the way she perceived her surroundings. The apartment was no longer just a physical space. It was a layered environment, part ordinary, part otherworldly. Every draft, every flicker of light, every imperceptible shift in shadow now carried meaning. She realized the threshold's presence would remain, subtly influencing, silently observing. She moved to the window, peering down at the city below. Cars moved like tiny insects along the streets, pedestrians unaware of the supernatural currents that ran above them, inside the walls of ordinary apartments. The awareness that she had survived the final confrontation brought clarity, but it also brought a new understanding. Vigilance was not a temporary state. It was continuous. The day passed slowly, marked by silence, punctuated by minor disturbances. A flicker of the hallway light, a draft that seemed to follow her movements, the faint whisper of a curtain against the window frame. Each instance reminded her that while the threshold no longer assaulted her, it still existed, still monitored. Ethan observed her reactions closely. The aftermath of an engagement like this is often underestimated, he said. People think the moment of confrontation is the peak. It isn't. The peak is managing the residual effects living within the awareness, integrating it into your consciousness without being consumed by it. Sarah reflected on his words. She had expected the threshold to either vanish or continue its attacks, but neither had happened. Instead, she found herself in a liminal state, a constant negotiation between fear and observation, presence and surrender. The energy that had once pushed and pressed now existed as a persistent hum, a reminder that she was being watched and that her actions carried weight. That evening, as shadows lengthened and light faded, Sarah prepared for the first night after the confrontation. She arranged the furniture carefully, aligning the room according to the markers Ethan had taught her. Every object had a purpose, every placement a defensive or observational strategy. The bed was shifted slightly to open the threshold, allowing energy to flow without obstruction. Candles were placed at key nodes, their flames small but purposeful, flickering against the walls like quiet sentinels. As darkness settled, she noticed the subtle changes. Shadows seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with her breathing. The oppressive weight of earlier nights was gone, replaced by a subtle, watchful presence. She could sense the threshold studying her, evaluating her continued awareness. This awareness was the currency she now traded with the threshold, a measured vigilance that maintained her safety while acknowledging the apartment's supernatural nature. Hours passed without incident, though the small, almost imperceptible phenomena persisted. A slight movement in the corner of the eye, the faint creak of floorboards that hadn't been touched, the whisper of air that seemed directed rather than random. Sarah maintained focus, conscious of every sense. She realized that surviving the final confrontation had not been an end, it was a beginning. A continuous engagement that required balance, mindfulness, and acceptance. Ethan returned briefly during the night, observing the apartment's responses. "Notice how it moves now," he said softly. "Before, it sought to unbalance you. Now it shifts subtly, testing boundaries without aggression. Your presence has changed the dynamic. You are no longer prey. You are recognized as a participant." Sarah watched the threshold's subtle movements, noting the interplay of shadows and light, the imperceptible currents in the air. For the first time, she felt a strange sort of companionship with the presence of mutual acknowledgement rather than fear-driven conflict. She understood that while the threshold could never be entirely tamed, it could coexist with awareness and deliberate action. Days passed, and Sarah began to integrate the apartment into her life. Routine provided structure, grounding her consciousness against the persistent hum of the threshold. Yet she remained vigilant, attentive to every detail. The threshold's presence was constant, and every interaction, however subtle, reinforced her understanding that human awareness and supernatural energy existed in a delicate balance. She began keeping a journal, noting changes in shadows, air currents, and emotional responses. Each entry was a record of engagement, a map of her coexistence with the threshold. She detailed the ways in which her awareness influenced the environment and noted how subtle shifts in posture, movement, and intention could alter the threshold's reactions. The act of documentation became a ritual in itself, a continuation of the negotiation that had begun during the confrontation. Ethan visited intermittently, observing and advising. "Remember," he said one evening, "the threshold is patient. It measures not only presence but also consistency. Awareness must be maintained, not intermittently displayed. Complacency is its opportunity. Mindfulness is your safeguard." Sarah understood. The apartment, the threshold, and her own consciousness were now intertwined. She had survived the initial escalation, confronted the threshold directly, and established a form of equilibrium. But equilibrium was not static. It was a living, dynamic state that demanded engagement and vigilance. Months later, the apartment remained unchanged in appearance, but transformed in essence. It was no longer a site of terror, but a complex environment of awareness and negotiation. Shadows shifted predictably. The air hummed with quiet energy, and Sarah moved through the space with deliberate confidence. She had learned to read the subtle signs, to anticipate the threshold's tests, and to maintain calm under influence. Despite the adjustment, the threshold's lessons remained clear. It was a force that would endure, an entity that observed and adapted, and a measure of human perception and resilience. Sarah had discovered that survival was not simply about escaping harm, but about understanding and negotiating with forces beyond ordinary comprehension. In the quiet moments, when the apartment seemed still, Sarah could feel the threshold's presence, not as a threat, but as a mirror reflecting her focus, her awareness, her persistence. The space was alive, and she had become an active participant in its dynamics. Fear no longer ruled her. Awareness did. Ethan left one final note before departing for extended field work. Your engagement is ongoing. Document, observe, maintain vigilance, and respect the threshold. It will test you in ways subtle and profound, but you now have the tools to survive. The apartment and the threshold are not enemies. They are teachers, and you are ready to learn. Sarah stood at the window once more, observing the city beneath her. The sunlight played across familiar surfaces, shadows retreating but lingering in awareness. The threshold was present, subtle, patient, but acknowledged. It had not been conquered, but it had been recognized, negotiated with, and integrated into her consciousness. And in that understanding, Sarah found a measure of peace. Not a piece of ignorance, not a piece of oblivion, but a peace rooted in engagement, vigilance, and deliberate presence. The apartment was still alive, the threshold still active, but the fear had been tempered by awareness, by the realization that she had survived, that she had learned, and that she could continue to coexist with a force beyond ordinary comprehension. The aftermath was not silence, nor was it absence. It was a living, breathing state of balance, one that required respect, observation, and consciousness. Sarah had endured, adapted, and emerged with insight that in the presence of forces unseen, the truest power was awareness itself. And as the city moved obliviously below, she smiled faintly. She was no longer simply a resident of an apartment. She was a participant in a space that was alive in ways most could never perceive. The threshold remained, patient and eternal, but now it was a presence she could navigate, a force she could acknowledge without succumbing, and a mystery she could endure. The apartment, the shadows, the threshold, they would continue. But so would Sarah, vigilant, aware, and resolute. The pilgrimage of blood. The night hung thick and suffocating over the old town, as if the very air remembered the horrors it had once witnessed. Detective Cole stepped through the iron gates of the abandoned warehouse district, his coat dampened by the mist that had settled over the cracked asphalt. His boots echoed faintly, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence. The case file clutched in his hand trembled slightly. It wasn't cold, but the weight of what it contained made his grip uneasy. Iris's testimony had been fractured, scared, but there was no doubt about the truth beneath her words. Something had gone irreversibly wrong in that gathering, and she had survived, where others hadn't. He remembered her trembling voice when she had first spoken in the dimly lit interrogation room. It was supposed to be enlightening, she said. We were promised knowledge, eternal knowledge, but it was never meant for us. Not like this. Her eyes had darted toward the ceiling, as if the room itself might swallow her words, and then back to Cole, pleading silently that he understand the horror she had lived. He did understand, even before she began. He had read the files, seen the photographs, noted the inconsistencies in the initial reports, and yet nothing prepared him for the gravity of her account. 9 men, 9 women, each offering 3 drops of blood to seal a covenant they didn't fully comprehend. Cole recalled the details vividly, the way Iris had described the ceremony. Jared, charismatic and commanding, had guided them in a low chant, drawing symbols in the air with a mix of precision and menace. The participants' hands shook as they pricked their fingers, letting the blood fall onto the parchment in a rhythmic, deliberate manner. "It's only a contract," Jared had said, his voice silky, persuasive, yet hiding a jagged undercurrent, the kind that makes promises feel like threats. Nothing more than an agreement between willing minds. Obedience, silence, sacrifice. The path to knowledge lies beneath. As he listened, Cole felt the lingering impression of fear Iris had carried for weeks, how each memory seemed to thrum in her veins like a heartbeat she could not stop. The participants' faces had been pale, eyes wide, the kind of terror that comes not from immediate danger, but from a creeping, existential realization that their fates had been rewritten without their consent. The ritual space had been arranged with deliberate symmetry. 9 candles forming a circle, a shallow basin in the center for the blood, and the subtle, almost imperceptible carvings along the walls that pulsed faintly in the flickering light. Iris had not known what they were, only that they seemed to shift when one wasn't looking directly. Cole traced the ritual in his mind. The first drop had been uneventful, a ceremonial initiation, but as the second and third drops fell, a subtle heat had risen from the circle, like the room itself inhaled and exhaled. Those who tried to speak, to protest, to explain themselves, found their voices caught in their throats. Their mouths formed shapes, but no sound emerged. The sensation had been suffocating, almost sentient, as if the ritual itself were testing their worthiness. Iris had remembered the gaze of Jared, steady and unwavering, the only participant seemingly untouched by the rising intensity. "The blood is only the key," he had whispered. "The silence is the lock." The participants obeyed, not because they trusted him, but because something beyond him commanded their compliance. Cole imagined the panic building in real time, the subtle tremor in limbs, the skin prickling with invisible currents, the sensation that each heartbeat was monitored by unseen eyes. Iris's recounting had included the names, the faces, the whispered promises made in private before the ceremony. Each had been tempted by something greater, the allure of eternal wisdom, and each had underestimated the price of such knowledge. Cole's own pulse quickened as he walked through the warehouse alleyways. He could see it in his mind, the circle of participants, blood pooled beneath their clasped hands, shadows stretching impossibly long against the walls. The ritual had begun under the guise of enlightenment, but there was an undercurrent of inevitability. The air, thick with incense and the metallic tang of blood, had carried a subtle vibration, almost musical, almost hypnotic, that no one could resist. Those who had been silent, those who had obeyed, had been granted a sliver of survival. Those who faltered had vanished. The detective's thoughts shifted to Iris's description of the old bailiff. The figure had appeared at the periphery of the vision, a ghostly enforcer dressed in antiquated colonial attire, face obscured beneath the shadow of a tricorn hat. The participants had frozen when he appeared, as though every cell in their bodies recognized an ancient authority. "Immobility is your safety," he had intoned. His voice, though quiet, had carried through every corner of the illusory chamber, resonating in their skulls, bending perception, commanding compliance. One wrong movement, one gasp of fear, and the bailiff's eyes, small red glints beneath the brim, had zeroed in on them. Iris had been last seen collapsing to the floor, eyes wide, heart hammering, yet somehow alive when the room returned to its mundane state. The others had not been as fortunate. Cole remembered her telling him how she could still feel the weight of the bailiff's gaze even now, lingering as a cold pressure against her skull. She had muttered of hearing faint whispers when she closed her eyes at night, echoes of a ritual that had extended beyond the corporeal, into memory, into consciousness, into soul. She had been told to forget, warned to remain silent, yet the story clawed itself back to her whenever she closed her eyes. Cole's mind wandered to the logistics. 9 men, 9 women, 3 drops of blood each. That simple arithmetic had built a lattice work of fate, a mechanism that exceeded ordinary morality or understanding. Each act of bleeding had tied them closer, a chain of vitality and obligation, until the unseen forces could exact their judgment. And the judgment, Cole realized, was impartial. It did not waver. It did not forgive. It was an algorithm of punishment, a supernatural calculus indifferent to human intent. He paused beneath the flickering streetlight. The mist coiled around him like living tendrils. He recalled Iris's final words in that interview, trembling, yet resolute. I did what I could. I broke the contract. She had choked on her explanation, hand shaking, and Cole had felt the raw weight of trauma transmit through the room. She had destroyed the parchment, she had swallowed the remnants, and by doing so, had denied the ritual its completion. But at what cost? The memory of those left behind haunted her nights. The screams, the absence, the sudden unnatural silences of those erased from the world. Cole walked on, boots clicking against the cracked pavement. He thought of Jared, the orchestrator, and Finn, complicit in facilitating the ritual. Both had been human, once, but now only shadows of ambition, greed, and failed morality. Cole could almost see them, caught in the intangible grip of the old bailiff, suffering the consequences of their betrayal. A slight shiver ran down his spine at the thought. It was not just fear, but the acknowledgement of laws older than men, older than morality, older than time. The night stretched before him, the warehouse looming ahead like a dark sentinel. Inside, he imagined, lay traces of what had occurred. Residual energy, bloodstains faintly humming with the memory of the ritual, walls scarred with the invisible etchings of the pact. He did not yet know what he would find, only that the past refused to stay buried. Iris's account had been a warning, a fragile thread connecting the living to the dead, to the unseen, to the mechanism of supernatural justice that spared none who trespassed with hubris. Cole inhaled slowly, tasting the damp mist and metallic tang that reminded him of the perilous convergence between mortality and the forces beyond. He could not fully comprehend it, and perhaps he never would. But he understood enough. Human ambition, when combined with ancient covenants, carried a price beyond comprehension. The ritual had begun in earnest, and though the participants believed themselves in control, the ritual itself had already claimed them. Survival was a temporary grace, and the old bailiff's judgment had only begun to unfold. With a final glance at the cracked asphalt, the silent warehouses, and the dim glow of the city beyond, Cole stepped forward. Each footfall carried him closer to the remnants of the covenant, to the echoes of blood and knowledge, to the shadow of an authority that transcended life and death. He could feel the weight pressing down, not from the air itself, but from the unbroken chain of ritual and consequence, the invisible tally of promises made in blood. And he knew, as he crossed the threshold into the first warehouse, that what awaited was not just evidence, but a lesson in the unforgiving calculus of the supernatural. A lesson in which all who trespass would ultimately pay, in ways both immediate and eternal. The moment the last drop of blood had fallen, the world seemed to collapse inward, not with noise, but with an oppressive, almost tangible silence. Iris remembered the sensation vividly. The room's edges had warped, shadows stretching and bending as if reality itself had inhaled deeply and held its breath. The walls, once ordinary plaster and paint, had taken on a subtle sheen, like dark water frozen mid-swirl. Candles burned brighter for a heartbeat, then dimmed, leaving only the low, pulsing hum that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The participants, now bound by the covenant they had foolishly signed, found themselves disoriented. The floor beneath their feet no longer resembled concrete. It rippled slightly with each step, sending a faint shiver up the spine. The air had grown thick, almost viscous, and each inhale seemed to draw them deeper into a dimension not entirely their own. Iris could feel the old bailiff's presence more strongly now, looming at the periphery of her perception, a silent sentinel enforcing the rules she barely understood. She clutched Finn's sleeve, the only human presence beside her, and he stared at her with the same mix of awe and terror that she felt. "Do you feel it?" Finn whispered, voice shaking. It's like the room is alive." Iris nodded, too terrified to speak. Her vision flickered, catching glimpses of other participants, some already frozen in place. their eyes wide with the shock of comprehension. The old bailiff had made it clear from the start. Movement without obedience invited punishment, and anyone who called out or expressed fear would pay the price. They had all been warned, in that moment of blood offering, that silence was the key. But silence was a fragile thing when fear screamed in every nerve. The rules were simple, yet impossibly cruel. Survival depended on absolute composure, strict adherence to unseen boundaries, and an understanding that the landscape around them was not just illusory, but actively responsive to thought, fear, and desire. The group was guided by an invisible hand, the old bailiff moving silently among them, though Iris could not tell whether he walked on the floor or merely hovered, tethered to some reality beyond their comprehension. His voice had returned once more, low and rasping, vibrating through the air and their bones alike. Immobility is safety. Speech is surrender. Breath too loud will betray you. The first trial came swiftly. They entered a corridor that seemed impossibly long, lined with countless doors. Each door was polished black, reflecting faint images of those who approached them, but distorted in ways that felt, "That's wrong." Faces elongated, eyes multiplied, mouths opened too wide and closed too quickly. A subtle pressure built in Iris's chest, the instinctive desire to cover her face and run clashing with the knowledge that any sudden motion could be fatal. She kept her steps measured, synchronized with Finn, silent, each inhale a controlled whisper of life. From the darkness beyond the corridor, faint sounds began to emerge. Distant cries, the rustling of chains, and the occasional metallic click. The old bailiff's warning echoed in her mind. Those who faltered would be removed, absorbed, or worse. She could sense the invisible touch of his authority, a cold pressure that pressed against the marrow of her bones, reminding her that each action, each thought was monitored. The rules were neither arbitrary nor forgiving. They were absolute. The first mistake came not from the frightened, but from the curious. One participant, a man named Lyle, reached toward a door, compelled by the flicker of movement he thought he saw behind its surface. His fingers brushed the polished black wood, and a sudden sharp snap of sound cut through the corridor like a whip. Lyle's body stiffened, eyes locked open, as if the life inside had been measured and found insufficient. The others froze, unable to move, unable to speak. When the corridor returned to its unsettling stillness, Lyle was gone. There was no body, no scream, only the faint echo of a wind that smelled of ash and iron. Iris felt a chill creep down her spine. She knew, in that moment, that the covenant was not merely a promise of knowledge. It was a binding, a contract enforced by forces older than any law or conscience. Every gesture, every involuntary blink, even the whisper of a breath could be judged. The rules were not taught, they were experienced, enforced, carved into their understanding through fear and survival. They continued down the corridor, each step measured, each heartbeat controlled. The old bailiff's presence was a constant, a pressure she could feel in her chest and the soles of her feet. The walls seemed to breathe with them, contracting and expanding, subtly reshaping the hallway. At times, she thought she saw shadows behind the doors, fleeting movements that were almost but not quite human. Those who looked directly into them too long found themselves pulled into the reflection, their forms dissipating like smoke. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast chamber, dimly illuminated by candles that burned without flame, floating above the ground in perfect symmetry. The old bailiff was there, motionless, a spectral figure observing them with a patient intensity. This room, Iris realized, was the heart of the trial, the lying pit. The air shimmered with an almost liquid distortion, and whispers of past participants, voices, long erased from reality, echoed faintly, warning, tempting, taunting. Jared stepped forward, attempting to assert control, but his voice caught in the shifting air. "Stay calm," he hissed, though his words trembled. "We follow the rules. We survive." The irony was not lost on Iris. Jared had orchestrated this, yet he was now as vulnerable as the rest. Finn's hand gripped hers tighter, and she could feel his fear transmitted through the simple human contact, grounding her, even as the chamber seemed to pulse with invisible intent. The rules of this place were laid bare in subtle, excruciating ways. One misstep, a breath too sharp, a flinch too visible, a gaze lingering too long could trigger immediate consequence. Those who failed were dragged into the floor, pulled down into the unseen depths, their screams absorbed into the ambient distortion of the room, leaving only memory and warning for the survivors. Iris held her tongue, controlled every tremor, forced herself to see without reacting, to breathe without betraying life itself. Time became meaningless. The old bailiff moved imperceptibly, and the chamber shifted with every deliberate act of restraint. Iris began to understand the cruel geometry of the trial. It was designed to unspool instinct, to extract raw terror, and to punish any thought that sought to cheat its structure. It was not about the blood she had offered, it was about obedience, and the recognition that survival was contingent upon understanding the invisible rules imposed by something far beyond human comprehension. And then, the whispers began. Not from the walls, not from the floor, but from the participants themselves. Names were muttered involuntarily, memories recounted aloud despite efforts to remain silent. The old bailiff's presence intensified, a slow pressing force that seemed to scan for any deviation, any betrayal. One by one, those who faltered vanished, erased from the continuum of space and time. By the time the chamber reached its peak intensity, only Iris and Finn remained. Their eyes wide, limbs taut, every sense heightened to unbearable acuity. Iris felt her pulse resonate with the old bailiff's authority, a rhythm she could not escape. Finn whispered something she barely heard. We can't fail now." And she nodded, knowing that failure meant more than death. It meant the complete erasure of self, a dissolution of identity into the machinery of the ritual. Every rule they had been forced to absorb was now alive inside them. Each breath, a test. Each glance, a potential execution. The journey had only begun. The chamber's walls seemed to stretch infinitely, yet every motion, every hesitation was tracked, catalogued, and judged. The air itself carried the subtle hum of the covenant, a resonance of blood, obedience, and silent terror. The old bailiff's shadow moved slightly, and Iris realized it was not bound by gravity or perspective. It existed in a plane beyond her senses, tethered only to the enforcement of rules she barely understood, but could not ignore. As they progressed, she began to grasp the fundamental truth. This pilgrimage was a test of conformity, a cruel calculus of survival. Knowledge, promised by Jared, was secondary to compliance. Life depended not on courage, nor cunning, nor physical endurance, but on the mastery of restraint, the perfection of stillness, the suppression of natural instinct. The rules were relentless, infinite, and precise, and breaking them had consequences that transcended ordinary mortality. By the time they emerged from the chamber's final distortion, Iris felt every fiber of her being stretched, tested, and scorched by the invisible forces governing the ritual. She and Finn had survived, but only because they had learned the language of obedience. The journey and the rules were one and the same. Understanding one meant mastering both, and yet even mastery offered no guarantee. The old bailiff's presence lingered, a constant, inescapable reminder that the Covenant's authority extended beyond perception, beyond fear, beyond the bounds of what they had thought possible. Iris exhaled, though the breath felt heavy, tainted by the memory of all those who had not survived. She knew that the rules had not ended, that the journey still demanded attention, vigilance, and complete adherence. And in that realization, she understood the magnitude of the Covenant. It was not merely a test, but a dominion over will and fear, a contract written in blood and enforced by the unyielding, eternal authority of the old bailiff. The chamber's oppressive stillness had become a living entity, an ever-watchful presence that pressed upon every nerve. Iris and Finn moved with deliberate care, their senses stretched to the breaking point, aware that the old bailiff was never far. Each step was measured, each glance calculated. Any lapse in attention could summon the merciless hand of judgment. The first trial had been the corridor, the second the lying pit, but the real tests were yet to come. trials designed to unravel not just the body but the very essence of the participants. The air shifted, thickened, and a subtle vibration rose from the floor beneath them. The chamber seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though it had been waiting for a heartbeat to be skipped. A breath taken too sharply, a glance misdirected. The walls, black and reflective, now mirrored not only their physical forms, but their deepest fears. Iris saw herself in those reflections alone, abandoned, her bloodied hands trembling, her face distorted in ways that almost seemed alive. The reflection was not a trick of light. It was a mirror of potential failure, a premonition of the consequences awaiting those who faltered. They came to a wide expanse, a room that appeared infinite in size. The air shimmered with a hazy iridescence, and the whispers of vanished participants returned, layered atop one another in an unsettling symphony. The old bailiff's presence intensified, coalescing at the center of the room like a dark nucleus of authority. His voice, low and resonant, carried across the expanse. Every action is weighed, every sound is noted. Those who fail will be unmade. The first trial in this space was deceptively simple in its presentation. A line of stones stretched across the floor, each carved with strange runes that pulsed faintly with a sickly green light. Finn stepped onto one, hesitated, and the rune flared. A harsh, resonant crack echoed through the chamber, and he stumbled slightly, regaining his balance with an audible intake of breath. Instantly, the floor beneath the nearest stone shifted, sinking slightly, and the shadows of the room stretched outward, as if trying to claim him. Iris seized his hand, pulling him forward, forcing him to focus on the rhythm of movement, the silent adherence to the rules they had learned. The challenge was clear. Navigate the stones without drawing attention, without letting instinctive fear betray them. The slightest misstep would invite judgment, the consequence potentially immediate and irrevocable. Each rune seemed to sense hesitation, responding with subtle tremors that sent a shiver of panic through the veins. Yet, stepping too quickly was equally dangerous. Precision and restraint were the only paths to survival. As they progressed, the chamber began to distort more aggressively. The air became hotter, then colder, alternating in rapid pulses that made the skin crawl. Shadows elongated unnaturally, and faint glimpses of other participants flickered at the edges of their vision, only to vanish when directly observed. The whispers intensified, now almost coherent, recounting memories of those who had failed. Names were spoken in low, accusatory tones, and Iris felt the weight of countless judgments pressing upon her. Finn shivered beside her, his grip on her hand tightening, and she could feel her own panic rising, not in her mind, but as a tangible, physical presence she had to suppress. The second trial was more sinister. The chamber seemed to collapse inward, folding upon itself in impossible angles. Doors appeared along the walls, each slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of horrifying tableau. Some contained visions of the participants themselves, maimed or dissolved into ash. Others revealed impossible landscapes, voids filled with teeth, eyes, and endless corridors of despair. The old bailiff's voice guided them, barely audible. Perception is your weapon. Composure is your shield. The unfaithful shall be taken. One participant, a man named Jonas, could not resist the lure of the doors. His curiosity, a natural human instinct, betrayed him. He reached for a handle, and the air seemed to thicken violently, pressing against his chest. A sharp, tearing sound filled the space, like fabric, ripping from the world itself. Jonas screamed a sound that seemed to echo in reverse, stretching and fracturing before vanishing entirely. The chamber returned to its previous stillness, as if nothing had happened, yet the void where Jonas had been remained, a subtle reminder of the old bailiff's merciless authority. Iris and Finn pressed on, their movements synchronized, their breathing controlled to the millisecond. The rules had become instinctual now. No sudden motions, no vocalizations, no unnecessary thoughts of fear or despair. Every micro-expression, every shift in posture was monitored, and even the slightest deviation risked being noticed. It was no longer a test of courage, It was a trial of complete mastery over self. The third trial revealed the chamber's true nature, a labyrinth of shifting floors and walls, a physical and psychological maze that bent reality around them. Gravity seemed inconsistent, stairs led to ceilings, and corridors twisted impossibly. At times, they could see themselves from above, their reflections following movements independently. The old bailiff's presence was inescapable, a spectral anchor that pulled them along the intended path, correcting deviations with invisible, suffocating force. Every decision now had consequences. They had to choose paths with perfect instinct, guided only by the residual memory of the rules imparted earlier. Any hesitation resulted in auditory hallucinations, whispers pressing upon their minds, accusing them, tempting them toward error. Iris could feel the presence of the fallen participants in these whispers, each a warning, each a potential distraction, intended to break their focus. Finn's occasional glance toward her face reminded her that she was not alone, yet his fear threatened to mirror and amplify her own. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in this suspended reality. The chamber punished them silently but relentlessly. The floor would shift under a misstep. Walls would compress with a subtle pressure, and the old bailiff's shadow would flicker closer. Iris realized that the collapse was not just physical, but psychological. It sought to unweave their understanding of the rules, to make them doubt every instinct, every movement, every thought. Those who failed vanished, their existence absorbed into the chamber's geometry, their absence felt in the weight of silence that followed. The final phase of this trial was the luminous gate, a shimmering archway that radiated both warmth and threat. It was the last test of obedience and composure. Only one misstep, breathing too heavily, stepping too boldly, or failing to suppress fear could result in erasure. As they approached, the chamber seemed to pull at them, a gentle but insistent force that tested every ounce of self-control they possessed. The old bailiff's presence intensified to a palpable density, filling the room with a sensation that was almost physical, a weight that pressed against their chests and legs. Iris's mind became a narrow, singular focus. She controlled her breathing, tuned out the whispers, measured each step, and allowed instinct to serve the rules rather than dictate action. Finn mirrored her, their movements synchronized in a fragile dance of survival. The luminous gate pulsed as they drew near, a heartbeat synchronized with the chamber itself. Any deviation would be catastrophic, yet they moved flawlessly, guided by instinct honed under the pressure of unrelenting terror. As they passed through, the chamber shifted one final time. The oppressive atmosphere did not vanish but transformed, the collapse ceasing as they emerged into a narrow corridor, their bodies trembling, minds raw from the ordeal. They had survived the trials of movement, of temptation, of perception, and of control. Yet the collapse had left scars, psychological fractures that would never fully heal. Iris understood now that the rules were infinite and merciless. The journey had forced them to comprehend that the old bailiff's power was not just about punishing mistakes. It was about ensuring absolute conformity, extracting obedience, and testing the very essence of will. And though they had survived, the covenant remained, a constant, unbroken tether between blood, obedience, and the unseen authority that governed this nightmarish pilgrimage. Finn exhaled shakily, and Iris met his gaze, sharing a moment of quiet acknowledgement. The trials had ended, for now, but the weight of what they had experienced would linger indefinitely. They had passed through a crucible that was not only supernatural but existential, learning that in this world of shadows, silence and control were the only currency of survival. And as the corridor narrowed and the light dimmed, Iris felt the old bailiff's eyes still upon them, a reminder that the journey, though momentarily complete, was far from over. The corridor narrowed into a series of uneven steps, each one slick with condensation that seemed to appear from nowhere. Iris's footsteps were measured, cautious, every nerve screaming for vigilance. Finn stayed close, his presence a fragile reassurance, yet she could feel his tension radiating like static electricity. Their ordeal through the trials had drained them, leaving muscles trembling and minds fraying, but the hardest test awaited the confrontation with the architects of the pilgrimage itself. Ahead, a faint, flickering glow illuminated a chamber that pulsed with a sickly golden light. It was both inviting and repulsive, a visual paradox that played upon the senses. As they entered, the air became dense, heavy with the scent of iron and something acrid: burnt hair, scorched wood, and the unmistakable tang of blood. The old bailiff's presence was palpable, a dark current that vibrated through the floor and walls. Yet, it was not the bailiff who drew their attention. Jared and Finn, those who had orchestrated this journey, stood waiting, their expressions a mixture of triumph and unease. Jared's voice, smooth and commanding, carried an unnatural resonance. "Well, you've made it this far. Not many do." His eyes glinted with an unsettling mixture of pride and malice. Finn, pale and shaking, avoided eye contact with Iris, his guilt tangible, yet insufficient to protect him. "Iris," Jared continued, "you've proven yourself worthy in some sense. But understanding comes at a cost." Iris's pulse quickened. Memories of her friends, of the others who had vanished, flashed before her eyes. She forced her trembling hands to remain at her sides. "Worthy? What do you mean?" she stammered, her voice taut with barely suppressed terror. Jared's smile widened, a serpentine curve that revealed the calculated cruelty beneath his charisma. The journey below was never about survival, not truly. It was a transaction. Every participant, every drop of blood, an offering. Each one bought a fragment of eternity. Every soul that succumbed, every life erased. It was not for punishment. It was for exchange. Finn's body trembled as he finally lifted his gaze. His lips parted in a whisper, guilt spilling out like a flood. "It wasn't meant to. I didn't think." "You sold them," Iris hissed, fury finally overtaking fear. "You sold them all. You betrayed them." Her voice echoed through the chamber, a sharp contrast to the low, oppressive hum of the old bailiff's presence. Jared's expression hardened. "It is not betrayal. It is business. Their fates were collateral for the knowledge we sought." He gestured toward the glowing sigils on the floor, each one throbbing in rhythm with the room, a heartbeat for the condemned. 8 years each. Longevity bought through sacrifice. Precision, commitment, obedience. That is the law here. The weight of the revelation pressed upon Iris with a physical force. Her friends, her classmates, all those who had trusted her, they had been pawns, exploited for the vanity and greed of two individuals. Rage and despair warred within her, each emotion threatening to overwhelm the fragile control she had maintained. Suddenly, the air shifted, thickening around her throat. The old bailiff manifested, its form towering, spectral, impossibly rigid, yet adorned in the colonial regalia that made its authority absolute. Its voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from beneath the floor, as well as within her skull. "The contract is binding. The blood is offered. The rules are known." Iris's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into palms as comprehension struck. The bailiff was not a mindless enforcer. It was the embodiment of the covenant, the living arbiter of the blood pledge. But she had learned something in the trials, something Jared and Finn could not have anticipated. The covenant was powerful, but not immutable. Knowledge and understanding were as much weapons as the blood itself. She reached into her coat pocket, her trembling hand closing around the tattered, blood-soaked contract she had taken from the ritual table earlier. With a sudden surge of defiance, she tore at the paper, each rip resonating through the chamber like a clap of thunder. Jared's face twisted in shock, his composure cracking, while Finn's knees buckled beneath the sudden surge of unleashed power. The old bailiff's form wavered, the golden pulse of the chamber reacting violently to the destruction of the contract. The rules themselves, inscribed in blood and will, began to unravel. Every line, every clause, every tethered soul shimmered, loosened, and threatened to vanish. Jared lunged forward, desperation clear, but the bailiff's gaze froze him mid-motion, an invisible force locking him in place. "You cannot override the covenant," the bailiff intoned, its voice echoing across space and time. Only those who bear the blood and understand its meaning may influence it. Iris's voice rang out, clear and unyielding. Then I bear it, and I understand. Her words carried the weight of all those lost, of every scream silenced, of every life extinguished unjustly. The chamber quivered violently as the bailiff's form strained against her declaration, its authority challenged by the rightful bearer of the contract. A light, faint and pale, began to emanate from the torn contract. The blood-stained pages folded in upon themselves, burning without fire, releasing a hissing exhalation that carried the scent of iron and ozone. Jared screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound, as invisible threads of power that had bound him and Finn to the Covenant snapped. Finn cried out, falling to his knees, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The old bailiff's towering form faltered, wavered, and then bowed slightly, an acknowledgement that the Covenant had been disrupted. The contract is broken, it admitted, its voice a mix of awe and resignation. The rules are rewritten. Iris stumbled forward, exhausted, bloodied, but resolute. She had survived the trials, exposed the betrayal, and nullified the mechanisms of death and control. Jared and Finn writhed, their screams now irrelevant to the bailiff, powerless against the authority they had once sought to command. The chamber pulsed one last time, violently, and then fell silent, a void of calm that replaced the oppressive tension. When she awoke fully, Iris found herself alone in the ritual chamber. The walls were intact but devoid of the previous glow, the floor unmarked, the air neutral, ordinary. She clutched what remained of the contract, now a fragile fragment of parchment, and knew that the power had shifted irrevocably. The betrayal had been revealed, the Covenant undone, and she, survivor and witness, was free. Yet, the experience left its indelible mark. Her memory was fragmented, scattered like the torn contract, faces and names blurred, timelines fractured. And somewhere deep within her subconscious, the old bailiff lingered, a reminder that the laws of blood, power, and obedience were not gone. They had merely been reset, waiting for the next transgression, the next test, the next pilgrimage. Iris stepped out of the chamber into the cool night air. The sky was unremarkable, stars faint behind the city's haze. She drew a long, shuddering breath, feeling the weight of survival and the cost it had exacted. Every step away from the chamber was a step into a world she no longer recognized, yet one she had the power to navigate. The betrayal had been exposed, the revelation claimed, and she carried the knowledge that, even in darkness, defiance and understanding could bend the rules of fate. Iris could still feel the pulse of the chamber beneath her feet, a subtle vibration that lingered like the echo of a heartbeat long gone. The air smelled faintly of iron and parchment, a reminder that the bloodshed and betrayal were not abstract. They were real, tangible, and lingering. Her hands shook as she gathered the fragments of the torn contract into a tight ball, the jagged edges biting her palms. She understood now. Survival alone was insufficient. To end the pilgrimage fully, she had to claim authority over the Covenant itself. Slowly, methodically, she reconstructed what remained of the contract. Each fragment was a puzzle piece, each word a tethered promise, each bloodstain a link to the lives lost. As she pressed them together, a soft luminescence began to seep from the parchment, faint at first, then growing with the weight of intention. This was not just paper. It was the physical manifestation of the Covenant, the literal embodiment of promises made in blood. It was alive, and it was waiting for her to assert dominion. Finn and Jared were still in the chamber, broken, terrified, their bodies pressed against the far wall, as if proximity to the contract could shield them from the judgment they had earned. Jared's lips moved soundlessly, trying to weave excuses, apologies, even lies. But Iris felt the futility radiating from him. Finn's gaze was wide, haunted, fixed entirely on her, as though she were some god capable of deciding his fate. But she could not falter. She could not let the pilgrimage continue its endless cycle of cruelty and death. The final contract needed to be rewritten. Drawing a deep, steadying breath, Iris whispered the first words aloud, Though her voice trembled, it carried the authority of one who had suffered, understood, and survived. This covenant is mine to command. I am its witness, its bearer, and its arbiter. Immediately, the fragments of paper began to glow, the luminescence deepening into a white gold that filled the chamber with a warmth that was both comforting and terrifying. The old bailiff's form appeared once again, towering, immutable, its presence demanding deference. Its eyes, those hollow spectral orbs, focused entirely on her. "You have altered the covenant." The bailiff's voice resonated, low and sonorous. "But to claim it powerfully, you must accept the cost." Iris's mind raced. She knew the cost. Knowledge, memory, fragments of her soul, perhaps even her own humanity. Yet she could not hesitate. Every step she had taken, every trial she had endured, had led to this point. "I accept," she said firmly. "All that I am, all that I hold, is for the covenant to obey the truth of justice." The bailiff's form bent slightly, acknowledging her claim. Then it gestured toward the glowing fragments of the contract. The fragments floated upward, orbiting around her, aligning themselves, weaving a lattice of light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The covenant was alive in her hands. And then, the test. The ritual required a complete severance of old bonds, a final reckoning with those who had exploited it. Jared and Finn were drawn forward involuntarily, unable to resist the gravitational pull of the contract. Jared's eyes widened in terror as he realized the finality of the moment. "Iris, please, You sold lives for your greed," Iris interrupted, her voice firm, echoing with authority. "You violated the blood that bound this covenant. The old bailiff does not forgive. I will ensure the debt is repaid." The chamber trembled. Invisible forces twisted around Jared and Finn, pulling them toward the center of the floating fragments. They screamed, a high, panicked shriek that reverberated off the walls, but there was no escape. The contract now fully reassembled, and alive consumed them, drawing out the dark energy they had invoked. Their screams transformed, distorted, and then abruptly ceased, leaving only the faint echo of anguish. Iris felt a searing heat in her mind, a rush of images, faces of the lost pilgrims, their last moments of terror, the betrayals and horrors they had endured. For a brief, terrifying moment, she understood everything. The mechanics of the pilgrimage, the exact workings of the covenant, the paths of power and sacrifice, the interplay between mortal will and supernatural authority. It was knowledge beyond comprehension. Yet she held it, focused, tempered by her humanity and her intent for justice. With the final contract complete, a profound silence fell. The old bailiff's form began to dissipate, its purpose fulfilled, leaving Iris alone in a chamber transformed. The oppressive weight of the trials had lifted. The air felt clear, clean, and ordinary for the first time. The golden glow from the contract dimmed to a faint shimmer, a reminder of the power now in her hands, tempered by the cost she had paid. She collapsed to her knees, exhausted, every muscle trembling. Blood and sweat coated her skin. Her chest heaved with the force of sheer survival. She clutched the contract to her chest, aware that it was now a living record of her defiance, a permanent testament to the exposure of betrayal and the restoration of balance. She had claimed authority over the covenant, and through it, over the chaos that Jared and Finn had tried to wield for selfish gain. Hours or perhaps days later, Iris emerged from the chamber. The outside world seemed impossibly mundane in contrast to the horrors she had faced. The city's skyline stretched before her, indifferent to her suffering, indifferent to the covenant that had been rewritten within a hidden chamber beneath the earth. Yet she felt an unshakable sense of power, a responsibility that accompanied survival. The pilgrimage was over, its cycle broken, and she was its sole living witness and guardian. Despite the clarity of victory, she was not unscarred. Memories flickered and fractured, faces and names blurred, and the weight of knowing truths that others could not perceive pressed upon her relentlessly. She understood now that survival carried a dual nature, freedom on one hand, and an eternal burden on the other. To bear witness to the covenant was to walk forever on the edge of understanding, never able to fully release the echoes of what she had seen, heard, and endured. Iris tucked the final contract into a secure bag, ensuring that it would remain intact, untouched by any who might attempt to exploit it. The fragments of parchment shimmered faintly, as if aware of her stewardship. Her journey through the pilgrimage had ended, but the vigilance required to maintain the Covenant's balance was only beginning. As she walked through the empty streets, the night air cool against her skin, a faint breeze carried a whisper, almost imperceptible. The Covenant is held. The blood has spoken. The journey is complete. For now. She paused, sensing that the words were both a warning and a reassurance. Somewhere in the shadows, the old bailiff lingered, a silent sentinel, its presence a reminder that rules of blood, power, and consequence were eternal. Iris drew a steadying breath and stepped forward. Every instinct screamed caution, yet she moved with resolve. The pilgrimage was over, its architects defeated, the Covenant restored. She had survived where others had fallen. She had rewritten the rules, dismantled the betrayal, and preserved the sanctity of the lives taken and the lives she would protect. The night stretched endlessly before her, an unbroken expanse of possibility. And as she vanished into the quiet streets, a single thought reverberated in her mind. Power, knowledge, and courage were inseparable from the cost they demanded, but she had endured, and the Covenant would remember. The final contract was hers. The pilgrimage concluded, and Iris, survivor of blood and shadows, would carry its legacy forever. You've reached the end of tonight's descent into darkness. 5 tales, 5 journeys through fear, deception, and the supernatural. The cursed buildings, the restless spirits, the cursed rituals, and the haunted pilgrimages have left their mark. But remember, horror does not end when the story stops. The shadows linger, and the echoes of the Covenant, the fire, the rituals, and the thresholds may still be waiting somewhere, just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Sleep carefully tonight. Listen closely, and beware of the whispers that might follow you home.